Eleanor Hayes stared at the paper in her hands, the afternoon light filtering through the small window of her childhood bedroom, making the ink seem to darken before her eyes. The handwriting was sharp and angry, pressing so hard into the parchment that it left indentations she could feel with her fingertips. Barren, not enough of a woman, discard. 3 sentences, 9 words. The sum total of John's assessment of their 3 years of marriage scrawled on the back of divorce papers like an afterthought. As if those 9 words could possibly contain the nights she'd spent praying the herbs she'd consumed, the shame that had grown inside her instead of a child. Eleanor Ellie, to those who had once loved her, folded the paper with precise movements, her fingers steady despite the storm inside her chest. She walked to the small hearth in her room, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the note. The paper curled, blackened, and disintegrated into ash that she caught in her palm. Ash Ridge, New Mexico Territory, spring of 1884. The world outside was waking from winter's grip, life pushing through the hard earth with stubborn determination. Life everywhere, except within her. A knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that could only be her father. "Eleanor?" His voice was flat as the dusty plains surrounding their small town. "It's time." She closed her fingers around the ashes, feeling them smear against her skin. In the small mirror above her wash basin, she saw a young woman of 22, blonde hair, pulled back, severely blue eyes that had forgotten how to hope. A woman whose worth had been measured and found wanting. "Coming, father." She tucked the locket containing her mother's portrait into the pocket of her faded blue dress, grabbed the small satchel that held the sum of her possessions, and opened the door to face Augustus Hayes, banker deacon, and a man who believed problems were meant to be solved with swift, practical measures. "The market square is filling up," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Your mother is waiting in the wagon." The dust swirled through Ash Ridge's market square, mixing with the smell of manure and charred wood from the blacksmith's forge. It was the kind of dry spring day where nothing moved unless it had to, where even the birds seemed to conserve their songs. Ellie stood on the wooden platform where livestock and farm equipment changed hands every Wednesday, her father's hand firm on her elbow as if she might flee. But where would she go? There was no place in this territory, perhaps in this world, for a divorced woman with no family willing to shelter her. The crowd gathered slowly, drawn by curiosity as much as commerce. Women looked away when Ellie caught their eye. Men assessed her with detached interest. Children peeked from behind skirts and trousers. "Next item," the auctioneer announced, a thin man with spectacles who usually sold horses and plows, not women. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Eleanor Hayes, age 22. Augustus stepped forward, pushing Ellie slightly ahead of him. "She can cook, sew, and work without complaint. She's educated, can read, write, and keep accounts." He paused, then added with businessman's frankness, "She's barren, tried for 3 years, no results, but she's got steady hands and all her teeth." The silence that followed was worse than laughter would have been. Ellie felt it wrap around her throat, stealing her breath. Near the back of the crowd, her mother stood with a worn shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the ground, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak, didn't try to stop this. Just watched as her only daughter was sold like defective merchandise. Ellie didn't plead. She'd done that before, once when John threw her out after the doctor confirmed she would never bear children, once when her wedding dress was torn from her by hands that used to hold her gently. It hadn't mattered then. So she stood in silence, dignity the only possession they couldn't take from her. "Starting bid," the auctioneer asked, voice uncertain. Silence stretched. Ellie's heart pounded against her ribs, but she kept her chin, level eyes focused on the distant mountains. If no one bid, what, then would her father be forced to take her back, or would she simply be left here, ownerless and unwanted? $2, a voice called from the back. A murmur rippled through the crowd as it parted. A man stood there, broad-shouldered and tall, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His shirt was wrinkled and travel-stained, his coat smelling of horse and pine. He didn't step forward to get a better look at her. He simply stood, feet planted firmly in the dust. $2, the auctioneer repeated. "Do I hear 3? No one spoke. No one raised a hand. $2 going once, twice. The man moved then, stepping forward not to examine Ellie, but to reach into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch and dropped several coins onto the auctioneer's table. The sound of metal hitting wood seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet square. "Sold," the auctioneer said, quickly, seeming relieved to be done with this unusual transaction. "To Mr. Reed," the man said. Mason Reed. Augustus raised an eyebrow. You sure you know what I said about her condition? Mason didn't flinch, didn't look at Ellie, his eyes green as summer grass but weathered at the corners, fixed on Augustus with quiet intensity. She won't be judged anymore, he said simply, then turned and walked away, leaving the coins on the table. Ellie didn't move, uncertain if she should follow. Her father gave her a small push. Go on, he said. You're his now. She bent to pick up her satchel, gripping it so tightly her knuckles whitened. As she stepped off the platform, she passed her mother, who reached out and pressed something into her palm, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Ellie tucked it into its pocket without looking, the first and only gesture of farewell. She followed Mason Reed through the dust, away from the only life she had known, towards something unknown but impossible to fear more than what she was leaving behind. The wagon waited near the blacksmith's, hitched to a pair of dun-colored mules, as quiet as their owner. It was an old wagon, weathered but well-maintained, loaded with sacks of grain and a few wooden crates stamped with general store on their sides. Mason gestured to the front seat without speaking. Ellie climbed up, settling her satchel at her feet. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, comfortable despite its hardness. Mason checked the harnesses one last time before climbing up beside her. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just flicked the reins gently, and the mules set off at a steady pace. They rolled out past the edge of Ash Ridge, where the prairie opened like a blank page waiting to be written on. The sky stretched endlessly above them, impossibly blue and empty of clouds. No birds, just wind in the grass and the occasional creak of leather. For the first hour, they traveled in complete silence. Ellie studied Mason from the corner of her eye, trying to assess what kind of man had purchased her. He wasn't old, but the sun had etched its history into his skin, mid-30s perhaps. His hands rested loose on the reins, one scarred across the knuckles, another with a long pale line running from wrist to thumb. No wedding ring, but a band of lighter skin suggested one had been there once. His profile was all angles, sharp jawline, straight nose, deep-set eyes beneath a furrowed brow. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking with a gravity to his features that spoke of someone who carried weight. When the sun had climbed halfway to its zenith, Mason reached beneath the seat and pulled out a dented canteen. He handed it to her without turning. Long ride, he said, the first words he had spoken since the auction. The water tasted like tin and old wind, but Ellie drank gratefully, her throat dry from dust and unspoken words. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed briefly. His were calloused but not rough. I'm not a prostitute, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. If that's what you're expecting. Mason glanced at her, then something like surprise flickering across his face before settling back into its neutral expression. He returned his gaze to the trail ahead. 5 kids, he said. No mother, no time. His words came out clipped as if each one cost him something to release. Ellie's throat caught. So I'm a governess. No, he said. Then after a long pause, a mother to them if you choose, or a companion, or a boarder. Your choice. She stared at him, genuinely surprised for the first time since her father had announced her fate. My choice, Mason nodded, once a small dip of his chin. Paid for your freedom, not your servitude. Ellie fell silent, turning his words over in her mind. Freedom wasn't a concept she had associated with being sold at auction. Yet there was something in the way Mason said it, not as a boast or a bargain, but as a simple statement of fact that made her wonder. The landscape rolled by, hour after hour, the mules maintaining their steady pace. The flatlands gradually gave way to gentle hills covered in scrub and the occasional stunted tree. In the distance, mountains rose blue and hazy against the horizon. By the time the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the trail, Ellie could make out a thin plume of smoke rising from a valley ahead. Home, Mason said, nodding toward it. Ellie squinted, trying to make out details. A small ranch tucked into the dry ribs of the land came into view as they crested a hill. The house leaned slightly westward, as if listening for something that never came. A barn stood behind it, weathered gray. Chickens darted through the yard, squawking as the wagon approached. A windmill turned lazily in the evening breeze, its metal vanes catching the last golden light. It wasn't much, certainly nothing like the respectable 2-story house she'd shared with John in town, but something about its resilience against the harsh landscape spoke to a stubborn kind of hope. Mason guided the wagon into the yard and stopped near the porch. He stepped down, tied off the reins, and began unloading the supplies without asking if she would follow. Ellie hesitated only a moment before climbing down, her legs stiff from the long journey. The porch boards creaked under her weight. The front door wasn't a door at all, just a thick quilt nailed to the frame to keep out the wind. Mason held it aside, waiting for her to enter first. Inside, 5 faces looked up, 4 boys and 1 girl, all wide-eyed and red-cheeked, each holding perfectly still in the half-light of early evening. They'd lost their mother to death or departure Ellie didn't yet know, and the silence in that cabin had the weight of long absence. The oldest boy, maybe 14, stood by the hearth, his posture rigid and protective. Beside him, a slighter boy clutched a worn book, spectacles perched precariously on his nose. On the floor, a freckle-faced boy sat cross-legged, dirt still clinging to his knees. The only girl, perhaps 7, wore a dress several sizes too large, her red hair a tangled mass down her back. She clutched a rag doll, missing 1 button eye. And the youngest, a boy no older than 5, sucked his thumb, enormous blue eyes so like Mason's, taking in Ellie with unabashed curiosity. "This is Ellie," Mason said, his voice gentler than it had been all day. "She'll be staying with us." The youngest boy removed his thumb from his mouth with a soft popping sound. He walked straight to Ellie and wrapped both arms around her leg, pressing his face against her skirt. The simple, trusting gesture caught her completely off guard. She stood frozen, unsure how to respond, a lump forming in her throat. Mason bent down, scooped the boy up with one arm, and opened a door with the other. "Room's upstairs," he said to Ellie. "Water is in the bucket, still warm." Ellie nodded, uncertain what else to do. She followed Mason's directions, climbing the narrow stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the rough-hewn wall. The upper floor held 3 small rooms. Mason pointed to the one at the end of the hall. "Yours," he said simply, before carrying the small boy into another room. The bedroom was small and plain, a narrow bed with an iron frame, a wash basin on a stand, a chest of drawers with one handle missing, and a window looking out toward an open field lined with fence posts and dry grass. She set her satchel down and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but covered with a clean quilt pieced together from faded fabrics. Someone had placed a small bunch of wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, blue and yellow blooms that somehow survived the harsh climate. Ellie didn't cry, not yet, but her hands trembled in her lap. She stayed there, listening to the sounds of strangers in a house that wasn't hers, wondering what kind of life she had been purchased into, and whether "your choice" were words she could truly believe. Ellie woke before dawn, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling above her. For a moment, she thought she was back in her childhood bedroom, but the sounds were wrong, a rooster crowing in the distance, the soft creak of the windmill, whispered voices from downstairs. Then yesterday's events rushed back: the auction, the long journey, the 5 silent children. She rose quickly, splashed water on her face from the basin, and changed into her second dress, nearly identical to the first, but with a small tear in the sleeve she'd need to mend. She pulled her hair back and secured it with pins, a routine so familiar she could do it without thought. The small bundle her mother had pressed into her hand still lay untouched on the chest of drawers. Ellie unwrapped it now, finding a small cake of lavender soap, her mother's one luxury, and a folded slip of paper. Inside, in her mother's neat handwriting, "May you find kindness where I did not place you." Not quite an apology, but the closest her mother could manage. Downstairs, the cabin stirred with early morning sounds. Footsteps on creaking boards, the thud of boots by the door, soft chatter broken by occasional coughs. Ellie moved carefully, uncertain of her place in this household routine. She didn't yet know who slept light, who spilled sugar, who liked their eggs hard or runny, if there were eggs at all. The main room of the cabin served as both kitchen and living area. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table with benches occupied the center, and a few mismatched chairs clustered near the hearth. Shelves along the walls held dishes, books, and various household items, all arranged with surprising neatness. Mason was already gone, the quilt door swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The children, however, were all present, watching Ellie with varying degrees of interest and suspicion. "Good morning," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally bright even to her own ears. "I'm Eleanor Hayes, Ellie. Your father told me your names, but I'm afraid I don't remember them all." A lie, but one she hoped might encourage them to speak. In truth, Mason had never mentioned their names. The oldest boy's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's not my father," he said, his voice edged with something hard. He's our people. Ellie nodded, accepting the correction. Of course, I apologize. A long silence followed, broken only when the youngest boy piped up. I'm Samuel, I'm 5. He held up one hand, finger splayed wide. And that's Thomas, he's 14. And Liam with the glasses, he's 11. And Jacob with the freckles, he's 9. And Hannah with the red hair, she's 7. Thomas shot Samuel an annoyed look, but the youngest seemed immune to his brother's disapproval. Thank you, Samuel, Ellie said, offering him a small smile. It's nice to meet all of you. She turned toward the kitchen area, noting the cast iron stove, the water pump at the sink, the basket of eggs on the counter. At least she could make breakfast, a simple way to begin establishing herself in this household. Would you like me to prepare breakfast? She asked, directing the question to Thomas, sensing he considered himself in charge in Mason's absence. Thomas shrugged. If you want, Pa usually makes cornmeal mush. Ellie nodded and set to work, grateful for the familiar task. She stoked the fire in the stove, found a pot, and began preparing the cornmeal. As she worked, she felt the children's eyes on her, assessing her every move. The children stayed quiet around her, each responding differently to her presence. Thomas watched with folded arms, in a look too old for his age, his posture suggesting he was ready to correct any mistake she might make. Liam whispered to Jacob, who kept glancing at Ellie like he was working out a problem in his head. Hannah sat near the fire and clung to her rag doll, occasionally touching the missing button eye, as if to reassure herself it was still gone. Samuel hovered nearby, mimicking Ellie's every move in silent fascination. Breakfast was simple but adequate: cornmeal mush with a bit of molasses and milk. The children ate quickly with the focused attention of those who'd known hunger. Only Thomas ate slowly, watching Ellie over each deliberate spoonful. Where did Pa find you? Liam asked, suddenly adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Before Ellie could formulate an answer, Thomas cut in. Don't ask questions that aren't your business, Liam. But Pa brought her here to help out. That's all we need to know. Ellie felt a rush of unexpected gratitude toward Thomas. Whatever his reasons, and she suspected they had less to do with protecting her dignity than maintaining his authority, he'd spared her the humiliation of explaining her circumstances. After breakfast, the children dispersed to their chores, Thomas and Jacob heading outside, Liam settling with a book, Hannah taking up a small broom to sweep, and Samuel remaining at Ellie's side like a shadow. Ellie tried to cook dinner that evening, beans and salt pork with biscuits, but the unfamiliar stove betrayed her. The beans turned to paste, the biscuits wouldn't rise. She spilled coffee grounds across the counter and burned her hand on the hot tin. Later, while lifting a pot of stew from the stove, her grip slipped. The cast iron crashed to the floor, stew splattering across the boards. The sound startled the chickens outside. Inside, the children froze. Ellie stood still, heart pounding, waiting for the shout, waiting for the snap she had heard before in John's house when she'd made similar mistakes. The front door opened. Mason stepped in, taking in the scene with a quick glance, the overturned pot, the stew spreading across the floorboards, Ellie's pale face. Without a word, he crouched, picked up the pot, dumped what little remained back into it, and wiped the floor with a nearby towel. It's just stew, he said simply, and that was it. He stood, placed the empty pot in the sink, and walked back outside. Ellie stayed frozen for another minute, the rag still in her hand, heat rising in her throat. Except this time it wasn't shame. It was something quieter, something she didn't yet have a name for. That night, after the dishes were scrubbed and the children had disappeared into their rooms, she sat on the porch with her hands in her lap. The night air was cool, stars burning bright above the roofline. She tried not to cry. She failed. Tears came silently streaming down her face as she stared up at the vastness of the sky. They weren't tears of despair, exactly, but of release, as if something tight and long-knotted had begun ever so slightly to loosen. A soft sound made her quickly wipe her cheeks. Mason stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight behind him. He didn't speak, just held out a mug of something steaming. Ellie took it, careful not to let their fingers touch. It was tea, sharp and bitter with pine needles, but it warmed her chest like something solid. Mason settled on the other end of the porch step, far enough away to be proper, but close enough that she could hear his steady breathing. They sat in silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead until the tea grew cold and the night chill drove them inside. The next week passed in a blur of small adjustments and quiet observations. Ellie learned the rhythm of the Reed household, when the children woke, what chores each was responsible for, how Mason expected things to run in his absence as he worked the small ranch. She discovered that Thomas disappeared for hours into the nearby woods, returning with game or wild herbs, but never an explanation. Liam spent every spare moment with his nose in a book, squinting through his ill-fitting spectacles. Jacob loved the outdoors, preferring to help with the animals and garden rather than indoor tasks. Hannah was silent but watchful, her green eyes so like her father's, missing nothing. And Samuel was a constant presence at Ellie's side, chattering about everything and nothing. Gradually, Ellie's hands found their steadiness again. Bread began to rise, beans stayed whole. She discovered the stove's temperamental nature and adjusted accordingly. She stitched feed sacks into handkerchiefs, one for each child, hemming the edges with neat, tiny stitches. They used them without comment, but she noticed Thomas tucking his carefully into his pocket. At night, after the children were asleep, Ellie explored the cabin. Not out of nosiness, but from a desire to understand the family she'd been brought into. The bookshelf contained a surprising variety of practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry, alongside well-worn copies of Shakespeare, Dickens, and several volumes of poetry. Someone in this house, Mason or his absent wife, had appreciated literature. It was during one of these nighttime explorations that Ellie made her first discovery. Under her pillow, nearly hidden by the case, lay a small leather-bound book. Opening it revealed handwritten entries, the flowing script distinctly feminine. On the inside cover, a name, Abigail Reed. Ellie knew she should close it immediately. Reading another woman's diary was an invasion she herself would resent. But the final entry, dated March 15, 1882, just over 2 years ago, caught her eye. Mason doesn't understand. No one understands. This darkness is too heavy. I cannot be a mother to these children anymore. The words sent a chill through Ellie. She closed the diary quickly, sliding it back under the pillow. Had Abigail Reed died, or had she simply left? And why had the diary been placed in what was now Ellie's room? She lay awake long into the night, listening to the settling sounds of the old house. Just before dawn, she heard whispers in the hallway, Thomas speaking to Hannah in hushed tones. "She'll leave," Thomas was saying, "just like Mother did. But what if she doesn't?" Hannah's voice was so soft, Ellie could barely make it out. "They always do," Thomas replied with the certainty of someone repeating a hard-learned lesson. The conversation confirmed what Ellie had suspected: Abigail Reed hadn't died. She had abandoned her family. The realization brought with it a confusing mix of emotions: sympathy for the children, curiosity about what had driven Abigail away, and an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this fractured household. The next morning, Ellie came downstairs to find Mason alone at the table, a mug of coffee cooling before him, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. He acknowledged her with a slight nod. "Children still asleep?" she asked, moving to the stove. "Thomas takes the older ones out early sometimes, teaches them tracking." Mason's voice was rough with disuse. Ellie nodded, setting water to boil. "Samuel, too. He sleeps late, like his mother did." The mention of Abigail hung in the air between them. Ellie measured coffee grounds carefully, her back to Mason, so he couldn't see her expression. "Mr. Reed," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase her question. "Mason," he corrected. "Just Mason." "Mason," she amended. I found something in my room, a diary." The silence behind her grew heavy. She turned to find Mason staring at his hands, which were clenched around his mug. "Abigail's," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I didn't read much, but—" Ellie hesitated. "The children seem to think she left willingly, that she might come back." Mason's jaw tightened. "She won't." "Do they know that?" "Thomas does. The others—" He shook his head. "They were young. Hannah was feed Samuel just 3. Easier to let them hope." "And you—" Ellie asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Do you hope she'll return?" Mason looked up, then his green eyes meeting hers directly for the first time since the auction. There was pain there, but no longing. "No," he said simply, "but I don't expect you to stay either." Before Ellie could respond, the quilt door swung open and Samuel padded in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The moment for further conversation had passed. Throughout the day, Ellie pondered Mason's words. He didn't expect her to stay. Was that a challenge, a warning, or simply a statement of resignation from a man who had learned not to count on permanence? That night, while checking on the children before bed, a habit she'd developed without really thinking about it, she paused at Hannah's door. The little girl was awake, sitting up in bed, running her fingers over the ragdoll's missing eye. Can't sleep, Ellie asked softly. Hannah shook her head. Would you like me to sit with you for a while? A hesitant nod. Ellie settled on the edge of the bed, careful not to crowd the child. That's a beautiful doll you have. Her name is Sarah, Hannah whispered. Mother made her for me before she went away. She did a fine job, Ellie said, noting the careful stitching, despite the doll's worn appearance. Sarah is missing an eye, though. Would you like me to sew a new one on for her? Hannah clutched the doll tighter. No, she has to stay the same for when Mother comes back. Ellie nodded, understanding. Of course, that makes sense. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant call of a nighthawk outside. Mother said she'd come back when she felt better, Hannah said suddenly. She promised. Ellie's heart ached for the child. Sometimes adults make promises they can't keep, she said gently. Not because they want to hurt us, but because they're hurting themselves. Are you hurting? Hannah asked, her directness catching Ellie off guard. I was, Ellie admitted, but not as much now. Will you go away too? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with more weight than a 7-year-old should have to bear. Ellie chose her words carefully. I don't know what the future holds, Hannah, but I'm here now and I'm not planning to leave. Hannah studied her face as if searching for a lie. Thomas says you will. He says all women leave eventually. Thomas is... Ellie paused, not wanting to dismiss the boy's pain, but unwilling to reinforce his cynicism. Thomas is afraid of being hurt again. Sometimes when people are afraid, they prepare for the worst to protect themselves. Are you afraid? Hannah's question was a whisper. Yes, Ellie answered truthfully. But being afraid doesn't mean you can't also be brave. Hannah considered this, then held out her doll. Sarah can sleep with you tonight, so you won't be afraid. The gesture, so unexpected and sweet, brought a lump to Ellie's throat. That's very kind, but I think Sarah belongs with you. Maybe instead you could teach me the song your mother used to sing to you. Then I'd have that to keep me company. Hannah's face brightened slightly. She sang Lavender's Blue. Do you know it? I do, Ellie smiled. Shall we sing it together very quietly so we don't wake the others? As their voices blended in the soft, ancient lullaby, Ellie felt something shift inside her, a small, warm spark where before there had been only cold ashes. On the 10th day, disaster struck. Hannah woke in the night, burning with fever, calling for her mother in delirious whispers. Ellie, who had taken to sleeping lightly, heard the child's cries and rushed to her bedside. Hannah's skin was hot to the touch, her nightgown soaked with sweat. Ellie's heart raced with fear. Childhood fevers could turn deadly so quickly, especially out here far from doctors and proper medicine. Thomas, she called, knowing the oldest boy slept in the next room. Thomas, wake up. He appeared in the doorway almost instantly, hair tousled but eyes alert. One look at Hannah and his face hardened. What did you do to her? He demanded. Nothing, Ellie said, keeping her voice calm despite the accusation. She has a fever. We need to cool her down. Can you get some water and clean cloths? Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between suspicion and concern for his sister. Please, Thomas, she needs help. Something in Ellie's voice must have reached him because he nodded curtly and disappeared. Moments later, Mason appeared, alerted by the commotion. Hannah's sick, Ellie explained quickly. High fever. Do you have any willow bark, mint, or sage? Mason didn't question her, didn't hesitate. Willow by the creek, mint in the garden box. I'll get them. While Thomas brought water, Ellie gently stripped Hannah of her sweat-soaked nightgown and bathed her with cool cloths. The child whimpered alternately, calling for her mother and pushing Ellie's hands away. Shh, it's all right, Ellie soothed, though she wasn't sure Hannah could hear her through the fever's haze. You're safe. We're taking care of you. Mason returned quickly with the herbs, and Ellie set to work. She boiled water, crushed the willow bark and mint, and steeped them together. The bitter medicinal smell filled the small room as she worked, bringing back memories of her grandmother teaching her which plants healed and which harmed. Through the night, Ellie sat with Hannah, spooning the herbal tea between the child's cracked lips, bathing her fevered skin, and singing softly when the girl grew restless. Mason brought fresh water and more herbs when needed, his presence a silent support in the doorway. Thomas, too, remained watching Ellie's every move with suspicious eyes that gradually gave way to exhausted concern as the hours passed. Near dawn, when the sky outside had just begun to lighten, Hannah's fever broke. She fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, her breathing steady, and her skin cool to the touch. Ellie sat back, her own body sagging with exhaustion. "She'll be all right now," she said softly to the two anxious figures who had kept vigil with her. "She needs rest and plenty of fluids when she wakes." Mason nodded, relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but weighted with genuine gratitude. Thomas said nothing, but as he turned to leave, he paused beside Ellie. "You didn't have to stay up all night," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, I did," Ellie replied. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of something like respect. When Hannah woke later that morning, weak but clear-eyed, the first thing she said was, "You didn't leave." Ellie, who had dozed in the chair beside the bed, smiled tiredly. "No, I didn't leave. Even though I was sick and gross, even though—" Hannah considered this, then announced, "I'm hungry." "That's a good sign," Ellie laughed softly. "What would you like to eat?" "Pancakes," Hannah said decisively, "with maple syrup. That's what Mother made when we were sick." A shadow crossed the girl's face as she realized what she'd said, but Ellie merely nodded. "Then pancakes it is if we have the ingredients. Let me check." As she rose to leave, Hannah caught her hand. "Ellie, thank you for taking care of me." The simple gratitude freely given touched Ellie deeply. "You're welcome, Hannah. Always." Mason stood into the doorway, having come to check on his daughter. He didn't say a thing, but the tension in his shoulders had eased. His eyes stayed fixed on Ellie like he was seeing something he hadn't expected, something strong, something steady, something worth noticing. Ellie didn't smile. She was too tired. But she didn't flinch from his gaze either. She simply nodded and turned back to Hannah, who was already dozing again. The next morning when Ellie came downstairs, steam curled from a kettle already warming on the stove. Next to it sat a tin mug and a piece of paper folded once. Two words scratched in stiff, uneven handwriting, "Thank you." No name, no signature, but it didn't need one. She held the note for a moment longer than she meant to, then sat down, wrapped her hands around the mug, and sipped slowly. The tea was sharp, bitter with pine, but it warmed her chest like something solid. Through the window, the prairie stretched out, wind brushing through wild grass. She watched it in silence, sensing that something in her, tired, tight, and long kept shut, had begun to shift. As spring settled into the bones of the land, the rhythm of the Reed household began to change. The children who had regarded Ellie with suspicion and distance gradually adjusted to her presence. Even Thomas, the most resistant, developed a grudging acceptance of her role in their lives. Ellie's hands found their steadiness again. The stove no longer intimidated her. The garden began to respond to her careful tending, and the mending pile diminished under her nimble fingers. She discovered an old loom in the barn and set about teaching Hannah to weave simple patterns, much to the girl's delight. In the evenings, while Mason repaired tools or worked on accounts at the table, Ellie taught letters by candlelight, helping Jacob trace his name on a piece of kindling, guiding Liam through more advanced texts, encouraging Hannah's first attempts at writing. Samuel, already knowing his letters despite his young age, proudly helped by pointing out each one he recognized. Only Thomas refused to join these sessions, though Ellie often caught him listening from his corner, where he whittled or mended harnesses with practiced hands. She learned what each child feared. Thomas hated thunderstorms, but would never admit it, tensing at each flash of lightning. Liam lied when embarrassed, his ears turning red as he fabricated elaborate explanations for simple mistakes. Jacob feared the root cellar, avoiding it at all costs after being locked in once by accident. Hannah got quiet when she missed her mother stroking her ragdoll's face with small, tender fingers. Samuel feared the dark, believing monsters lived under his bed. For each fear, Ellie found a remedy. She kept Thomas busy during storms, giving him tasks that required concentration. She never called out Liam's lies directly, instead offering him face-saving truths. She accompanied Jacob to the cellar each time, never rushing him. She sat with Hannah in silent companionship when the girl grew withdrawn, and she checked under Samuel's bed each night, declaring it monster-free before tucking him in. None of them asked her who she was or where she had come from. They watched what she did, listened to how she spoke, observed how she stayed even when things were difficult. They were children who had been abandoned once. They recognized the difference between presence and absence with an acuity that broke Ellie's heart. One evening, as Ellie was mending a tear in one of Liam's shirts, she came across a folded paper tucked into the pocket. Curious, she opened it to find a detailed drawing of a woman's face, clearly done from memory, by a child's hand, but unmistakably meant to be Abigail Reed. The resemblance to Hannah was striking, the same heart-shaped face, the same slightly upturned nose. "That's private." Ellie looked up to find Liam standing in the doorway, his thin face flushed with anger or embarrassment, she couldn't tell which. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, folding the paper again. "I found it in your pocket while mending your shirt. It's a beautiful drawing." Liam's flush deepened. "Thomas says I'm stupid for making them, that I should forget her like she forgot us." "Thomas is hurting," Ellie said gently. "Sometimes people say harsh things when they're in pain." "Do you think she forgot us?" Liam asked, his voice small. Ellie considered her answer carefully. "I don't know your mother, Liam, but I think it would be very hard to forget children as remarkable as you and your siblings." "Then why did she leave?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the confusion and pain of a child's broken trust. Ellie patted the space beside her on the bench, and after a moment's hesitation, Liam sat. "Sometimes adults make choices that have nothing to do with how much they love their children," she said. "Sometimes they're ill in ways we can't see, or they're afraid, or they believe they're doing what's best even when it doesn't seem that way to others." "Pa says she was sad all the time after Samuel was born," Liam confided. "He says she had the melancholy and it got worse instead of better." Ellie nodded. She'd heard of women suffering from profound despair after childbirth, a condition that could drive them to desperate acts. "That happens sometimes. It's an illness like a fever or a cough, but it affects how people think and feel instead of their bodies." "Could she get better?" "Maybe," Ellie said, not wanting to offer false hope but unwilling to crush the boy's fragile optimism. "Some people do." Liam took the drawing back, smoothing it carefully with his palm. "I make one every year on her birthday, so I won't forget what she looked like." "That's a wonderful way to remember her," Ellie said. "Would you like me to find a safe place to keep them? A folder or a box, perhaps?" Liam looked up, surprise and gratitude mingling in his expression. "You wouldn't make me throw them away?" "Of course not. Memories are precious, Liam. We should treasure them even when they're painful." Later that week, Ellie gave Liam a small wooden box she'd found in the barn and lined with soft fabric. The boy's solemn thank you, accompanied by a quick, shy hug, was worth far more than the simple gift. It was around this time that Ellie discovered the most profound change in the household. She was in the kitchen rolling out dough for an apple pie, a special treat, using the last of the winter apples when Liam came in looking for a pencil. "Here, Mama, I found one," he said, reaching past her to grab a stubby pencil from the shelf. The room went still for a beat. Liam froze, suddenly aware of what he'd said. He didn't correct himself. Neither did Ellie. The word hung in the air between them, enormous and fragile as a soap bubble. Liam backed away, cheeks flaming, and disappeared into the main room. Ellie continued rolling the dough, her hands steady despite the riot of emotions in her chest. She didn't call attention to it, didn't make it into a moment of significance that might embarrass the sensitive boy further. But the next day, Jacob said it while passing her a basket of eggs. Then Hannah asking for help with her hair. Then Samuel, who'd already decided she belonged to him and simply made it official. And that was that. She was Mama now. No ceremony, no announcement, just the slow naming of what had already begun to be true. Mason never commented on the children's new name for her, but she caught him watching, sometimes his expression unreadable, as the word passed easily between them and her. One evening, as May gave way to June and the days stretched long and golden, Ellie sat on the porch steps watching fireflies rise from the grass like earthbound stars. The children were asleep, the house quiet behind her. She'd found an old piece of lace in a trunk and was contemplating how to use it for Hannah's upcoming birthday, perhaps a collar for her dress or a decorative edge for a new apron. The porch boards creaked as Mason settled beside her a respectful distance away. He'd been working on accounts at the table, his brow furrowed in concentration for hours. Now he looked tired, but somehow lighter, as if he'd set down a burden temporarily. "Night's nice," he offered his version of conversation. Ellie nodded, appreciating the simple observation. "The fireflies are early this year." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl from the woods beyond the barn. The moon rose nearly full, casting silver light across the yard. "You ever think about leaving?" Mason asked suddenly, his eyes still on the distant horizon. The question caught Ellie off guard. I did, she said truthfully. At first. He nodded once, accepting her answer without judgment. Why didn't you? Ellie looked out at the dark fields where the swings she'd hung from the oak tree moved slowly in the breeze. Samuel loved it, demanding pushes that sent him soaring, high as the birds. Mama, high as the birds. For the first time in my life, she said slowly, finding the words as she spoke them. No one's asking me to be anything I'm not. Mason turned to look at her, then really look at her as if seeing past the surface to something essential underneath. The intensity of his gaze might have made her uncomfortable once, but now she met it steadily. The children care for you, he said, his voice low. They need you. I care for them too, she replied simply, and perhaps I needed them as well. Mason nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Good night, Eleanor, he said, rising to his feet with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. Good night, Mason, she replied, watching as he disappeared into the house, leaving her alone with the fireflies and the feeling that something significant had just transpired between them, a question asked and answered, a foundation laid for whatever might come next. It wasn't until she was nearly asleep that night that Ellie realized it was the first time Mason had called her by her full name, not Miss Hayes, not Ellie, but Eleanor. The realization brought with it a strange warm flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the children and everything to do with the man who had purchased her freedom and then remarkably given it back to her. The town of Riverford crouched low on the horizon, a cluster of weather-beaten buildings bleached nearly white by the relentless sun. Unlike Ash Ridge, with its pretensions to respectability, Riverford was a place of practical necessity, a trading post, a few stores, a saloon, and a small church whose steeple listed slightly to one side, as if unsure of its welcome in such hardscrabble surroundings. Ellie hadn't set foot in any town since the day Mason had purchased her at auction. For 6 weeks, her world had consisted solely of the Reed Ranch and the wild land surrounding it. The prospect of facing strangers, of being seen, and perhaps recognized as that barren woman who was sold, made her stomach clench with anxiety. You don't have to come, Mason said, noting her hesitation as he hitched the mules to the wagon. List is short, can manage alone. But there was flour to be bought, sugar for Hannah's birthday cake fabric, for new shirts the boys had long outgrown, and a dozen other necessities that required selection by someone with a discerning eye. Besides, Ellie had her own money now, $1 Mason had insisted on giving her for her work around the ranch. Not wages, he'd been careful to explain, but her share. The distinction mattered to him, and increasingly to her as well. I'll come, she said, climbing up beside him. The children need proper supplies. Samuel begged to join them, but Mason was firm. Next time, son, stay with Thomas. Mind what he tells you. As they pulled away, Ellie glanced back to see Samuel's small figure waving vigorously beside Thomas, who stood straight-backed and solemn, already a man in his bearing, if not yet in years. The journey to Riverford took 2 hours across increasingly parched landscape. June had brought no rain, and the earth was beginning to show signs of thirst. Grass turned yellow at the tips, creek beds reduced to trickles, dust rising at the slightest provocation. Dry year, Mason observed, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. Might be trouble come August, if no rain falls. Ellie nodded, understanding the implications. Drought meant poor grazing for livestock, failed crops, and hardship even for well-established ranches. For the Reeds, with their precarious finances, something she'd gradually become aware of through Mason's careful economies and late-night calculations, it could be disastrous. The garden's doing well with the water channeling we set up, she offered, and we could preserve more this summer as a precaution. Mason glanced at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. You're thinking ahead. Of course, she replied. It's my home too now. The words slipped out unbidden, and Ellie felt a moment of panic. Was she presuming too much? But Mason's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he gave a slight nod before returning his attention to the trail. As they approached Riverford, Ellie smoothed her dress, her best one saved for this occasion, and adjusted her bonnet to shield her face. Mason seemed to sense her nervousness. Town's small, he said. Few people. Quick trip. His attempt at reassurance touched her. I'll be fine, she said, straightening her shoulders. Just been a while since I've been around strangers. Mason guided the wagon down Riverford's main street, nodding at the occasional passerby. People seemed to recognize him, returning his greeting with varying degrees of familiarity, but no one approached directly. There was a reservedness to Mason that discouraged casual interaction, a quality Ellie had come to appreciate in their shared living space, but now saw as a buffer between them and the outside world. They stopped first at the general store, a long, narrow building with a covered porch and windows displaying everything from tools to candy. Inside, the store smelled of coffee leather and the sharp tang of pickles in barrels. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, looked up as they entered. "Reed," he acknowledged with a nod. "Been a while." "Ferguson," Mason returned. "Need supplies." As Mason handed over his list, the shopkeeper's curious gaze shifted to Ellie. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his head slightly. "This is Eleanor," Mason said, and then, after the briefest hesitation, "My wife." Ellie froze, the word hitting her like a physical blow. "Wife," she darted a glance at Mason, but his expression revealed nothing, his eyes steadily meeting Ferguson's. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Reed," Ferguson said, his tone indicating this was news of some significance. "Didn't know Mason here had remarried." "Recently," but Mason said shortly, effectively ending that line of conversation. "Got the flour I ordered." While Mason discussed provisions with Ferguson, Ellie moved through the store in a daze, examining bolts of fabric and jars of preserved goods with unseeing eyes. "Wife." The word echoed in her mind, bringing with it a confusing tangle of emotions. Surprise, indignation at not being consulted, and something else, something warm and unsettling, she didn't dare examine too closely. When they emerged from the store an hour later, the wagon loaded with their purchases, Ellie finally found her voice. "You told him I was your wife," she said quietly as Mason untied the mules. Mason paused, not looking at her. Simpler explanation than the truth. Which is, now he did turn, his green eyes meeting hers directly. "That I bought you at auction, that you're living unchaperoned with a man you're not married to, that the town gossips would make life difficult for you and the children if they knew." Put like that, Ellie could see his point. Still, the deception sat uneasily with her. "You might have warned me." "Should have," he acknowledged. "Didn't think. I apologize." The simple apology, offered without excuse or defensiveness, took the edge off her irritation. "Well, I suppose I am Mrs. Reed to the people of Riverford now." "Only if you choose to be," Mason said, his tone suggesting this was entirely her decision. "Could set the record straight. Tell Ferguson the truth." Ellie considered this. The truth would mean social ostracism, whispers behind hands, pitying or condemning looks. It would affect not just her, but the children as well, who were finally beginning to find stability after their mother's abandonment. "No," she said finally. "Let them think what they will. It's no one's business but ours." Mason nodded, relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. He climbed up beside her, took up the reins, and was about to set off when a woman's voice called out, "Ellie Eleanor Hayes, is that you?" Ellie turned, her heart sinking as she recognized the voice. Margaret Williams, her former sister-in-law John's younger sister, stood on the boardwalk outside the milliner's shop, her expression a mixture of shock and malicious delight. "It is you," Margaret exclaimed, approaching the wagon. "John said your father had sold you off, but I scarcely believed it. Yet here you are." Ellie felt Mason tense beside her, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Hello, Margaret," she said calmly. "Yes, it's me." Margaret's gaze shifted to Mason, taking in his weathered appearance with poorly concealed disdain. "And this is your purchaser." The deliberate cruelty of the word made Ellie flinch, but before she could respond, Mason spoke. "Mason Reed," he said, his voice level but with an edge of steel beneath. "Eleanor's husband." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Husband? My, that was quick work. Does John know his discarded barren wife has already found another man willing to overlook her deficiencies?" Each word was precisely calculated to wound, and Ellie felt them like physical blows. But something had changed in her since the day she stood on that auction block. She was no longer the woman who accepted judgment in silence. "My husband knows exactly who I am," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "As for deficiencies, I'd say the only one on display here is a lack of basic human kindness." Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. Before she could recover, Mason flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward, leaving her standing in the dust. They rode in silence for several minutes, Ellie's hands trembling slightly in her lap as the adrenaline of the confrontation faded. Finally, Mason spoke. "You handled that well." Ellie gave a shaky laugh. Did I? I've never spoken to Margaret like that in my life. Should have, Mason said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Needed saying. Ellie glanced at him, struck by the quiet approval in his voice. Thank you for what you said about being my husband. Mason kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his hand moved to cover her briefly, a touch so light and quick she might have imagined it. Truth enough for the likes of her. They rode on, the sun beating down on their backs, the town of Riverford diminishing behind them. Ellie found herself pondering Mason's words. Truth enough. Not a lie exactly, but not the full truth either. Something in between, like the status of their unusual household, like the nature of the bond forming between them, like the future that stretched ahead, unwritten but not entirely blank. As they crested the final hill and the Reed Ranch came into view, Ellie felt a surprising sense of homecoming. The weathered house with its leaning walls, the barn with its patched roof, the oak tree with Samuel's swaying in the breeze, all of it had become familiar, welcomed hers in some undefined way. Mason, she said suddenly, why did you really buy me that day? He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a murmur. Saw your eyes, he said, standing there with everyone looking through you, not at you, but your eyes. They weren't broken, bent maybe, not broken. He paused, reminded me of something worth saving. Ellie didn't respond, couldn't respond past the tightness in her throat. But as they pulled into the yard and the children came running to meet them, Samuel launching himself at her with complete trust, Hannah reaching for the promised fabric, Jacob eager to show her a bird's nest he'd found, she thought perhaps she understood what Mason had seen in her that day. Not just a woman in need of rescue, but one with the capacity to build something from ruins, to nurture, to grow, to thrive in seemingly barren ground. The midsummer heat lay heavy over the land, pressing down like a physical weight. 6 weeks without rain had turned the prairie brittle, the grass crackling underfoot, the creek behind the barn reduced to a series of stagnant pools. The sky remained a relentless blue, cloudless and unforgiving. In the garden, Ellie worked with fierce determination, implementing water-saving techniques she remembered from her grandmother, a woman of mixed heritage whose Navajo ancestors had cultivated the desert for generations. She built small channels to direct every precious drop of well water, arranged stones to create shade for delicate plants, and mulched heavily with straw to retain moisture. The children helped even Thomas, who had developed a grudging respect for Ellie's practical knowledge. They carried water from the well in buckets, spread mulch where directed, and took turns operating the hand pump that kept the garden alive. Will the plants survive, Mama? Hannah asked, her small face serious as she patted soil around a struggling bean plant. Some will, some won't, Ellie answered honestly, but we're giving them their best chance. The garden had become more than just a source of food. It was a tangible symbol of Ellie's place in the household. She had taken the small plot Mason's wife had once tended, long since gone to weeds, and transformed it through sheer determination and daily care. Inside the house, Ellie implemented similar economies. She preserved everything that could be preserved, mended, and remade clothing with ingenious adaptations, and stretched their supplies with creative cooking. The children never went hungry, though their meals grew simpler as the drought continued. Mason worked from dawn until well after dusk, checking on cattle, repairing fences, damaged by desperate animals seeking water, and riding out to help neighbors in similar straits. He returned each evening dusty and exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepening as the dry spell wore on. Ellie began to notice small changes in him, how his shirts hung looser on his frame, how his hands sometimes trembled with fatigue before he hid them under the table, how he pushed his own plate towards Samuel or Hannah when he thought no one was looking. One evening after the children were asleep, Ellie confronted him as he sat at the table reviewing accounts by lamplight. You're not eating enough, she said without preamble, setting a mug of tea beside him. Mason didn't look up. Eating plenty. You're giving your portions to the children. Growing kids need more. And you need strength to work, Ellie countered, sitting across from him. You can't help them if you collapse from exhaustion. Mason finally raised his eyes to hers, and the weariness she saw there alarmed her. Hard times coming, Eleanor. Droughts worse than I've seen in years. Creeks nearly dry, wells dropping. Might have to sell some cattle before they starve. It was the most he'd spoken at once in weeks, and the gravity of his tone told her more than his words. The situation was dire. "How bad are the finances?" she asked quietly. Mason hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to sharing such concerns. Then with a sigh, he pushed the account book toward her. "See for yourself." Ellie studied the neat columns of figures, her stomach tightening as she understood what they represented. The ranch was already mortgaged, the loan payments barely met each month. Cattle prices were dropping as everyone tried to sell ahead of the drought, and there was a substantial payment due to the bank in Riverford by September. "If we can't make the payment," she began. "We lose everything," Mason finished. "Land, house, livestock." The starkness of it hung between them, a threat to everything they'd built together over the past months. "There must be something we can do," Ellie said, her mind already racing through possibilities. "We could sell the loom from the barn or some of the books." "No," Mason cut her off, his voice suddenly sharp. "Those are for the children. They're mother's things." Ellie nodded, understanding. Despite everything, Mason had preserved Abigail's possessions for the children's sake, maintaining that connection to their past. "Then what about my brooch?" she suggested. "The silver one with the pearl. It was my grandmother's. It must be worth something." Mason shook his head. "Won't take your inheritance." "It's my choice," Ellie insisted. "This is my home too, my family." The word hung in the air between them, weighty and significant. Family. Not by blood or even by law, but by choice and circumstance and the quiet daily acts of care that had bound them together. Mason's expression softened. "Thank you, but not yet. Still have options." Before Ellie could press further, a cry came from upstairs, Samuel waking from another nightmare. She rose automatically, but Mason placed a hand on her arm. "I'll go," he said. "Rest. You've done enough today." She watched him climb the stairs, his steps heavy with fatigue, but his back straight, refusing to bend under the weight of his responsibilities. In that moment, something shifted in Ellie's heart, a deepening of respect, a flourishing of feeling she wasn't yet ready to name. Later, alone in her room, Ellie removed the brooch from its hiding place in her satchel, turning it over in her hands. The silver was tarnished, the single pearl yellowed with age, but it was beautiful still, a tangible link to the grandmother who had taught her strength and survival. "I may need your help yet." "Grandmother," she whispered, pressing the cool metal to her lips before returning it to its hiding place. The next morning, Ellie woke to an unfamiliar sound, a soft patter against the roof. For a moment, she lay still, disbelieving. Then with a gasp, she rushed to the window. Rain, gentle but steady, transforming the parched earth before her eyes. Already small rivulets formed between the garden rows, and the leaves of her precious plants lifted toward the life-giving moisture. She heard exclamations from the children's rooms, followed by the thunder of feet down the stairs. By the time she dressed and joined them, they were already outside, faces turned up to the sky, laughing as the cool drops spattered their sun-browned skin. Mason stood on the porch, his expression one of profound relief as he watched the rain soak into his land. When he turned and saw Ellie, something passed between them, a shared understanding of what this reprieve meant, a moment of pure, uncomplicated gratitude. "You did this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Ellie laughed. "I didn't make it rain, Mason." "Kept hope alive," he said simply, "when I couldn't." Before she could respond, Samuel spotted her and came running, his clothes already soaked through. "Mama." The rain dance worked. Ellie smiled, remembering how she'd taught the children a simplified version of her grandmother's rain ceremony the previous evening, more as a way to channel their worry into action than out of any expectation it would work. "So it did," she agreed, lifting the boy into her arms despite his wetness. "So it did." Later, after the initial excitement had faded and the practical work of collecting rainwater in every available container was underway, Ellie found Thomas alone in the barn. He was sorting through a pile of leather scraps, his expression unusually pensive. "Need help?" she offered, keeping her distance. Despite the thawing in their relationship, Thomas still maintained certain boundaries, and Ellie respected them. He shook his head. "Just thinking." Ellie turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "That dance you showed us," he said. "It's Indian, isn't it?" The question caught her off guard. She'd never spoken to the children about her heritage, unsure how Mason would react to the knowledge that the woman caring for them was part Navajo. "Yes," she admitted. "My grandmother was Navajo. She taught me many things about living in harmony with the land." Thomas nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Is that why you know so much about plants and water and stuff? Partly, Ellie said. The rest I learned by watching and doing. Pa doesn't know, does he, about your grandmother? No, Ellie acknowledged. I haven't told him. Thomas was silent for a moment, his fingers working the leather absently. You should, he said finally. Pa's not like some folks. He judges people by what they do, not who their people are. The assessment coming from Thomas carried special weight. He'd known Mason longer than any of them had seen him at his best and worst. I'll consider it, Ellie promised. Thank you, Thomas. He shrugged, already retreating behind his customary reserve. Just saying. As Ellie turned to leave, Thomas spoke again, his voice so low she almost missed it. I'm glad you didn't leave, like she did. The words, simple but profound, stayed with Ellie throughout the day, a reminder that trust once broken was rebuilt, not through grand gestures, but through steady presence, through choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. That night, as the rain continued to fall in a gentle, steady rhythm, Ellie sat on the porch watching the darkness. The air smelled of wet earth and renewal of possibilities dormant, but not dead. Mason joined her, offering a mug of coffee, a luxury they'd been rationing carefully. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Thomas thinks I should tell you about my grandmother, Ellie said eventually. Mason sipped his coffee. Your business to tell or not. She was Navajo, Ellie continued, watching for his reaction. My mother's mother. She lived with us until I was 12. Taught me about plants, weather, the old ways of seeing the world. Mason nodded, his expression unchanged. Explains your garden. Way you read the ski. It doesn't trouble you, Ellie asked carefully. Now Mason did turn to look at her, genuine confusion in his eyes. Why would it? Many people consider Indians savages, Ellie said softly, less than human. Many people are fools, Mason replied simply. Judge folks by their actions, not their bloodlines. Thomas had been right. The realization warmed Ellie more than the coffee in her hands. Here was a man who saw people clearly, without the distorting lens of prejudice or preconception. Thank you, she said. Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Nothing to thank, just sense. They fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now. Easier, more intimate, a silence that held possibility rather than constraint. When Mason finally rose to go inside, he paused beside her chair. Glad you're here, Eleanor, he said, his voice so low she felt rather than heard it. Drought or no drought. It wasn't a declaration of feeling, wasn't even particularly poetic. But coming from a man who measured words as carefully as water in a dry season, it was everything. July merged into August, the rain a distant memory, as the heat reasserted itself with brutal intensity. The brief respite had allowed the garden to flourish temporarily and had replenished the creek, but the drought's grip on the land remained firm. On a particularly scorching afternoon, as Ellie knelt in the garden, salvaging what vegetables could be harvested, before they succumbed to the heat, she heard the pounding of hooves approaching the ranch. She straightened, shielding her eyes against the sun, and saw Mason riding hard toward the house, another horse following with a figure slumped in the saddle. Thomas, she called, knowing the boy was nearby repairing a garden fence. Come quickly. By the time Mason reached the yard, Thomas and Ellie were both running to meet him. As they drew closer, Ellie could see that the second rider was barely conscious, swaying dangerously with each step of his mount. Found him on the South Range, Mason said tersely, dismounting in one fluid motion. Heat stroke. Bad. Together they helped the man down, a stranger to Ellie, though Mason seemed to know him. He was perhaps 40, with a weathered face and clothes that spoke of long days on the trail. Get him inside, Ellie directed. Thomas, fetch cold water and cloths, and tell Hannah to bring my herb box. They half carried the man into the house, laying him on the small sofa in the main room. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, his breathing rapid and shallow. Classic signs of severe heat exhaustion that could quickly become fatal if not treated. Ellie worked efficiently, removing the man's boots and outer clothing, bathing his face and chest with cool water and coaxing small sips of water mixed with salt between his cracked lips. Mason assisted, silently following her directions without question. Who is he, huh? Ellie asked as they worked. Wade Calloway, Mason replied. Ranch hand from the Peterson place north of here. Good man. As if hearing his name, Wade stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Reed," he croaked. "That's you, Bushy." "Here," Mason confirmed, moving into the man's line of sight. "You're at my place. Wife's taking care of you." Wade's confused gaze shifted to Ellie, and she saw recognition slowly dawn. "You... you're the Hayes woman, from Ash Ridge." Ellie's hand stilled momentarily, her heart racing. So he knew. Had been at the auction, perhaps? Or heard about it afterward? "Yes," she said, resuming her ministrations with deliberate calm. "I'm Eleanor Reed now." Wade closed his eyes again, whether from exhaustion or discomfort at the situation Ellie couldn't tell. She continued working, aware of Mason's gaze on her, but unable to meet it. When Wade had been stabilized and fallen into a natural sleep, Ellie rose, her back stiff from kneeling beside the sofa for so long. "He should rest here tonight," she said, keeping her voice professional. "The ride back to his ranch could trigger a relapse." Mason nodded. "I'll let the Petersons know he's safe." He hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but Hannah appeared in the doorway, asking if the patient needed anything else. The moment for private conversation passed. That evening, after a simple dinner, during which the children peppered the recovering Wade with questions about his life as a ranch hand, Ellie sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The day's events had left her unsettled, the casual exposure of her past, a reminder that secrets rarely stayed buried in small communities. She heard the door open behind her, but didn't turn, knowing from the tread that it was Mason. He settled on the step beside her, closer than usual, their shoulders almost touching. "Wade's resting comfortably," he said. "Fever's down." Good, good," Ellie replied, still looking at the stars. "He should be able to travel tomorrow if he drinks plenty of water." Mason was silent for a moment, then, "You called yourself Eleanor Reed." It wasn't quite a question, but Ellie heard the inquiry beneath it. It seemed simpler than explaining. "Besides, it's what everyone in Riverford believes." "Not just Riverford anymore," Mason observed. "Wade will talk when he gets home. Word spreads." Ellie sighed, acknowledging the truth of this. "Does it bother you, people thinking we're married when we're not?" Mason considered this, his profile strong against the night sky. "Does it bother you?" "I asked first," Ellie said, a hint of teasing in her voice. The corner of Mason's mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Doesn't bother me, unless it causes you trouble." "It's actually been protective," Ellie admitted. "Being Mrs. Reed gives me a place and identity beyond that barren woman who was sold." Mason nodded, understanding. "Then you remain Mrs. Reed to the world. Your choice." "And to you?" The question slipped out before Ellie could reconsider it. "Who am I to you, Mason?" He turned to her fully, then his green eyes reflecting the first stars of evening. "You're Eleanor," he said simply, "the woman who heals sick strangers and teaches my children to read and makes gardens grow in dust. You're necessary." Necessary, not a romantic declaration by any means, but from Mason, with his economy of words and feelings, it was profound. To be necessary to this man, to these children, to this place, it was more than Ellie had ever expected to be, to anyone again. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're necessary to me too." They sat in silence after that, watching the stars multiply above them, their shoulders just touching a small point of contact that nonetheless seemed to Ellie like a bridge being built plank by careful plank between two wary, wounded souls. The next morning, Wade Calloway departed with profuse thanks and a promise to return the favor should the Reeds ever need help. As Mason walked him to his horse, Ellie overheard a fragment of their conversation. "You got lucky, Reed," Wade was saying. "She's good people. Don't see why her first husband let her go." "His loss," Mason replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "My gain." Ellie turned away quickly, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping, but the words echoed in her mind throughout the day. My gain, as if he truly considered her presence in his life a blessing, rather than a burden or a convenience. That afternoon, as Ellie was hanging laundry to dry in the relentless sun, she spotted a figure approaching on horseback from the direction of Riverford. The rider was still too distant to identify, but something about the way they sat in the saddle, straight-backed and proper, suggested it wasn't a ranch hand or a neighbor. She shaded her eyes, watching as the horse and rider drew closer. Beside her, Hannah appeared, attracted by Ellie's attentive posture. "Who is it, Mama?" the girl asked, squinting into the distance. "I'm not sure," Ellie replied, a vague unease settling in her stomach. Why don't you fetch your father from the barn? Hannah ran off and Ellie continued watching the approaching rider. As they came into clearer view, she realized with a jolt that it was a woman slim, fashionably dressed, despite the heat, her posture rigidly correct. By the time the rider reached the yard, Mason had emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He walked forward to meet the visitor, his stride measured, but his shoulders tense in a way Ellie had learned to recognize as wariness. The woman reined in her horse, looking down at Mason with an expression Ellie couldn't quite read from her position by the clothesline. They exchanged words too quiet for Ellie to hear, and then the woman dismounted with practiced grace. It was only when she removed her riding hat that Ellie got a clear view of her face, heart-shaped with delicate features and startlingly familiar green eyes. Hannah, Ellie breathed, understanding dawning like a thunderclap. This woman was an older, refined version of Mason's daughter. This was Abigail Reed. She had come back. Time seemed to stop as Ellie stared at the woman who had abandoned her family 2 years earlier. Abigail Reed was beautiful in a fragile porcelain way, fair-skinned, despite the sun, with copper-colored hair pinned neatly beneath her riding hat, and those unmistakable green eyes that she had passed to both Hannah and Samuel. Mason stood rigidly before her, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Even from a distance, Ellie could see the tension in his jaw, the stiffness of his shoulders. This was a man bracing himself against an expected blow. Hannah emerged from the barn where she'd gone to fetch her father and froze mid-step when she saw the visitor. For a heartbreaking moment, the little girl looked uncertain, her gaze darting between the elegant stranger and her father's taut profile. Then recognition dawned. "Mother," she whispered the word carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. Abigail turned and her composed expression faltered at the sight of her daughter. "Hannah," she said, her voice higher and more refined than Ellie had imagined. "Look how you've grown." Hannah took a hesitant step forward, then another, her small face a storm of conflicting emotions. Behind her, Liam appeared in the barn doorway, his spectacles sliding down his nose in his haste, his eyes widening in shock. "Mother," he echoed, disbelief and fragile hope mingling in his voice. And then Samuel, who had been napping inside, burst through the quilt door, awakened by the commotion. He stopped short at the sight of the unfamiliar woman, confused but curious. "Who's that lady, Mama?" he called to Ellie, who still stood frozen by the clothesline. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Mama. Samuel's innocent question, directed at Ellie with complete trust, seemed to ripple across the yard, changing the quality of the air itself. Abigail's gaze snapped to Ellie, taking in her worn dress, her sun-browned skin, her hands reddened from work. Something flickered in those green eyes, surprise, confusion, and then a dawning understanding. Mason cleared his throat. "Children, this is your mother. She's come to visit." Visit, not return, not come home, just visit. The careful choice of word was not lost on anyone. "Hello, Samuel," Abigail said, her voice softening as she addressed her youngest child. "Do you remember me?" Samuel shook his head, moving closer to Ellie with the instinctive caution of a child faced with a stranger. "No, ma'am." The simple response seemed to strike Abigail like a physical blow. She paled slightly but maintained her composure. "I suppose you were very young when I left." "You're in my drawings," Liam offered, stepping forward. "I kept making pictures so I wouldn't forget your face." A shadow of pain crossed Abigail's features. "That was very thoughtful, Liam." Thomas chose that moment to emerge from the woods where he'd been checking trap lines. He stopped dead at the edge of the clearing, his face draining of color as he recognized the visitor. For a long, suspended moment, he simply stared, his expression a mixture of shock, anger, and something like fear. "Thomas," Abigail said, taking a step toward her eldest son, "you've become a man." Thomas didn't respond, didn't move. His gaze shifted to Mason, a silent question in his eyes. "Perhaps we should go inside," Mason suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "It's hot out here." The tension broke and everyone began to move at once, Abigail following Mason toward the house, Hannah and Liam trailing close behind Samuel, running to Ellie and tugging at her skirt in confusion. Only Thomas remained motionless, watching the procession with haunted eyes. Ellie knelt beside Samuel. "Go with your father, sweetheart," she said gently. "I'll be in shortly." Once the boy had reluctantly joined the others, Ellie approached Thomas, who still stood at the edge of the clearing like a statue. "Thomas," she said softly, "are you all right?" He turned to her, his young face aged by shock and betrayal. "She's back," he said flatly. "After all this time, she just rides in like she was never gone." "I know," Ellie said, resisting the urge to touch his arm to offer physical comfort he would likely reject. "It's a shock for everyone." "Why now?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Why come back now when we're finally—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "I don't know," Ellie admitted, "but I think we should hear what she has to say." Thomas's jaw tightened. "She abandoned us. Left us without a word. What could she possibly say that would matter?" "I don't know that either," Ellie said honestly, "but your siblings deserve a chance to hear it, whatever it is." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the tension of his shoulders and the clench of his fists. Finally, he gave a sharp nod and strode past Ellie toward the house, his back rigid with barely contained emotion. Ellie followed more slowly, her own thoughts in turmoil. What did Abigail's return mean for the fragile family they had built, for the children who had just begun to heal, for Mason, who had never spoken of his wife with bitterness, but whose pain was evident in the careful way he preserved her memory for their children? And what did it mean for Ellie herself, who had come to love these children as her own, who had begun to see a future in this place with these people? As she approached the house, Ellie hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain of her place. Was she intruding on a family reunion? Should she give them privacy to reconnect with their long-lost mother? Before she could decide, Mason appeared in the doorway. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and strained, "please join us." The use of her full name, formal and deliberate, sent a chill through Ellie. It was as if, in the space of an afternoon, they had reverted to the cautious strangers they had been months ago. Inside, the scene was painfully awkward. Abigail sat primly on a chair that had been pulled to the center of the room, her riding gloves folded neatly in her lap. Hannah and Liam sat on the floor near her feet, gazing up with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Samuel had retreated to a corner, watching warily. Thomas stood by the window, arms crossed, expression closed. "Mrs. Reed was just explaining that she's been living in Denver," Mason said as Ellie entered, his tone carefully neutral, "with her sister. Alice has a lovely home," Abigail added, her voice light but brittle. "She and her husband have been very kind, helping me recover my health." "Were you sick, Mother?" Liam asked earnestly. Abigail hesitated, glancing at Mason, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, Liam, I was unwell in my mind. After Samuel was born, I became very sad, and the sadness wouldn't go away. The doctor called it melancholia." "Is that why you left?" Hannah asked, her small face solemn. "Because you were too sad to stay with us." Pain flashed across Abigail's features. "It's difficult to explain, Hannah. I wasn't myself. I couldn't take care of you properly, and I thought you might be better without me." "We weren't," Thomas said flatly from his position by the window. "We weren't better without you." Abigail flinched as if struck. "I know that now, Thomas. That's why I've come back. To make amends if I can." "Back," Mason's voice was sharp. "You're staying?" Abigail smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture at odds with her composed demeanor. "I've taken a room at the hotel in Riverford for now. I heard you had remarried, and I didn't want to complicate things." Her gaze moved to Ellie, curiosity and something else, assessment perhaps, in her green eyes. "You must be Eleanor. Wade Calloway mentioned you when he returned to the Peterson Ranch. He spoke very highly of your nursing skills. Mrs. Reed was kind enough to care for Wade when he suffered heat stroke." Ellie confirmed, deliberately using the formal address to acknowledge Abigail's rightful claim to the name. "Please call me Abigail," the other woman said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "After all, we share a connection to these children." The conversation continued in this vein for another hour, painfully polite, skating around the deeper issues at hand. Abigail asked about the children's education, their health, their interests. She did not ask about their feelings regarding her absence or their hopes for her return. Mason spoke little, answering direct questions with minimal words, his face a careful blank. Finally, as the afternoon waned, Abigail rose to leave. "I should return to town before dark," she said, gathering her gloves. "But I would like to visit again if that's acceptable. Perhaps take the children on an outing." Mason glanced at the children, then at Ellie before responding. "Need to think on it," he said. "This is unexpected." Abigail nodded, accepting his caution. "Of course, I understand." She turned to the children. It was wonderful to see you all. You've grown so much, become so real somehow. In my mind, you were frozen as you were when I left." It was perhaps the most genuine thing she had said all afternoon, and it seemed to touch the children. Hannah stepped forward hesitantly and offered a small curtsy. "Goodbye, Mother. Will you come again soon?" "As soon as your father permits, my dear," Abigail replied, casting a pointed glance at Mason. After awkward farewells, Mason walked Abigail to her horse, leaving Ellie alone with the children. They stared at her with wide, confused eyes, clearly seeking guidance she wasn't sure she could provide. "Well," she said finally, forcing a brightness she didn't feel, "that was quite a surprise, wasn't it? How about we start supper while your father sees your mother off?" "Is she really staying in Riverford?" Liam asked, his voice wavering slightly. "For how long?" "I don't know," Ellie admitted. "I suppose we'll find out more when your father returns." "She looks different than in my drawings." Liam continued, his brow furrowed. "Smaller somehow, and her voice is higher." "People often change in our memories," Ellie said gently. "It's hard to hold on to all the details." "She didn't hug us." Hannah observed a note of disappointment in her voice. "Not even Samuel, and he was her baby." "Perhaps she wasn't sure if you would welcome it," Ellie suggested, though privately she had wondered at the same thing. Abigail had maintained a physical distance from her children throughout the visit, as if afraid to breach the gap her absence had created. Thomas, who had remained silent since his earlier outburst, suddenly spoke. "She's not staying," he said with certainty. "She'll leave again. She always does." Before Ellie could respond, the quilt door swung open and Mason entered. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with an emotion Ellie couldn't quite name. "Papa," Hannah ventured, "is Mother coming back tomorrow?" Mason ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "Not tomorrow, Hannah. She's agreed to give us some time to adjust to the idea." "Is she coming back to live with us?" Liam asked, hope and anxiety mingling in his voice. Mason's gaze flicked to Ellie, then away. "No," he said firmly. "Your mother and I are no longer married in the ways that matter. She may visit if that's what you children want, but she won't be living here." "Because of Mama Ellie?" Samuel asked innocently, clutching Ellie's skirt. The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its directness. Mason knelt to his youngest son's level, his voice gentling. "Because sometimes, Samuel, people change in ways that mean they can't live together anymore. Your mother has her life in Denver now, and we have ours here. With Mama Ellie," Samuel confirmed, satisfied with this explanation. Mason's eyes met Ellie's over the boy's head, a complex mixture of apology, reassurance, and something deeper that made her heart skip. "Yes," he said, "with Ellie." Later that night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, their rest delayed by excitement and confusion, Ellie found Mason on the porch, staring into the darkness. She settled beside him close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and waited. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for this afternoon. Didn't know she was coming." "Of course not," Ellie said. "How could you have? Should have prepared the children better." "Prepared you." His voice was rough with self-recrimination. "You handled it as well as anyone could have," Ellie assured him. "It was a shock for everyone." Mason was silent for a long moment, his profile sharp against the night sky. "She wants to take them," he said finally, "back to Denver. Says they'll have better opportunities there, better schools, society." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. "All of them, even Samuel. All except Thomas, says he's too old, too set in his ways." Mason's voice held a bitter edge. "Too much like me is what she means." "She can't just take them," Ellie protested. "They're your children too. You have rights." "Law favors mothers," Mason said simply, "unless they're proven unfit. And Abigail has her brother-in-law's money behind her now. Lawyers, influence." "What about what the children want?" Ellie asked, her mind racing. "Surely they have some say." Mason shook his head. "Too young in the eyes of the law, except Thomas." "And what do you want?" Ellie asked softly. Mason turned to her, then his green eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. "Want them here, with me, with—" He hesitated. "With us." "Us." The word wrapped around Ellie's heart like a warm hand. "Then we'll fight for them," she said firmly. "Together." "Not your battle, Eleanor," Mason said, though there was a question in his voice. "Isn't it?" Ellie challenged. "Haven't they become my children too in all the ways that matter? Haven't we become a family? Mason studied her face, searching for something doubt, perhaps, or a fear. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Yes, he said, we have. He reached out, then his calloused hand finding hers in the darkness. It was a simple gesture, but for Mason, a man of actions, rather than words, it was a declaration. They sat together in the quiet night, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead and silently preparing for the battle that lay ahead. The next week passed in a strange state of suspended tension. Abigail did not return to the ranch, but her presence in Riverford cast a long shadow over their daily lives. The children were unsettled, alternating between excitement at their mother's reappearance and anxiety about what it might mean for their future. Thomas withdrew further into himself, spending long hours in the woods or working silently alongside Mason. Liam constantly redrew his portraits of Abigail, trying to reconcile his memories with the reality he had encountered. Jacob became uncharacteristically quiet, watching the adults with wary eyes. Hannah vacillated between clinging to Ellie and practicing ladylike behaviors she imagined might please her mother. Only Samuel seemed relatively unaffected, too young to fully understand the undercurrents of tension. Ellie maintained the routines of the household with deliberate normalcy, providing the stability she knew the children needed. But in private moments, doubt crept in. What place would she have if Abigail succeeded in taking the children? Would Mason still want her presence if the reason for her coming, the motherless children, no longer applied? On the 7th day after Abigail's visit, Mason rode into Riverford to speak with her directly. He returned late, his face grim, his shoulders set in a rigid line that spoke of barely contained anger. She's filed papers, he told Ellie that night after the children were asleep. Seeking custody of Hannah, Liam, Jacob, and Samuel. Claims the ranch is no proper place for them, especially with the drought threatening our livelihood. Can she do that? Ellie asked, though she already knew the answer from his expression. Judge Collins is hearing the case next week, Mason confirmed. He's known for favoring mothers in custody disputes. There must be something we can do, Ellie insisted. Character witnesses, proof of the good life they have here. Been thinking on that, Mason said, his voice steadying. Spoke to Ferguson at the general store. He's known the children since they were born, seen how they've thrived these past months. He'll speak for us. And Wade Calloway, Ellie suggested. He saw firsthand how capable we are, how the children are part of a functioning household. Mason nodded. Already asked him. He's willing. What about... Ellie hesitated, uncertain how to phrase her next thought. What about our situation? Will it complicate things that we're not actually married? Mason's jaw tightened. Abigail raised that point, suggested it was improper for the children to be raised by an unmarried woman living in my home. The implications stung, though Ellie had expected as much. I could stay in town during the hearing, she offered. Remove that argument from her arsenal. No, Mason said with unexpected force. Won't let her dictate our household. Won't act ashamed when we've done nothing wrong. His vehemence surprised and touched Ellie. Then what do we do? Mason was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. Could make it official, he said finally, the words coming slowly as if each one required careful consideration. If you were willing. Ellie's heart stuttered in her chest. Official marriage, Mason clarified, his eyes meeting hers directly. Real, not just for Riverford's gossips. The proposal, if it could be called that, was so practical, so characteristically Mason in its lack of romantic flourish, that Ellie almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Is that what you want? She asked carefully. To marry me for the sake of the custody hearing? Mason shook his head. Not just for that. Been thinking on it for a while now. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Not good with words, Eleanor, but what we've built here, you, me, the children, it's real. More real than anything I had with Abigail, even before she changed. It was perhaps the longest speech Ellie had ever heard from him, and the rawness of emotion beneath his measured words moved her deeply. I care for you, Mason, she said softly, and for the children, but marriage is significant. Too soon, he asked, a note of vulnerability in his voice that made her ache. No, Ellie said, surprising herself with the certainty of her answer. Not too soon, just, I want to be sure we're doing this for the right reasons, not just to counter Abigail's legal maneuvers. Mason considered this, his expression thoughtful. Right reasons, he repeated, like caring for each other, building a life together, choosing each other every day. Yes, Ellie said, warmth spreading through her chest at his simple articulation of what marriage should be. Exactly like that. Then my reasons are right, Mason said with quiet confidence. Have been from the moment you stayed up all night with Hannah's fever. Maybe even before. Ellie's throat tightened with emotion. This wasn't how she had imagined a proposal, sitting on a porch step discussing it like a practical arrangement while a custody battle loomed. And yet there was something profoundly fitting about it, something that honored the steady, quiet way their bond had formed. Yes, she said simply, I'll marry you, Mason Reed. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a sureness that belied the newness of such contact between them. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of their decisions settling around them like a mantle heavy with responsibility, but also strangely comforting in its certainty. Should tell the children, Mason said eventually, before we go to town. Tomorrow, Ellie agreed, together. As she rose to go inside, Mason stood with her, still holding her hand. In the faint moonlight, his face was a study in shadows and angles, but his eyes were clear and steady on hers. Thank you, he said softly, for choosing us. Thank you for finding me, she replied, equally soft, for seeing something worth saving. The next morning they gathered the children in the main room after breakfast. Thomas, sensing something significant, stood by the window, his posture alert. The younger ones sat at the table exchanging curious glances. Your father and I have something to tell you. Ellie began feeling suddenly nervous despite her certainty about their decision. Are we moving to Denver? Liam blurted, his face pale with worry. No, Mason said firmly. This is our home. We're staying here. Then what is it? Hannah asked, fingers worrying the edge of her dress. Mason glanced at Ellie, then back at the children. Eleanor and I have decided to marry. For real, not just for the town's sake. She'll be your mother in the eyes of the law, as she already is in our home. There was a moment of absolute silence as the children absorbed this news. Then Samuel launched himself at Ellie with a whoop of joy, wrapping his arms around her legs. So you're staying forever and ever, he demanded, beaming up at her. That's the plan, Ellie confirmed, smoothing his hair affectionately. Hannah approached more cautiously, her expression serious. What about Mother, our first mother? Your mother will always be your mother, Ellie assured her, kneeling to the girl's level. Nothing changes that. She gave you life, and that's a precious gift. But families can grow and change, and there's room in your heart for both of us in different ways. Hannah considered this, then nodded slowly. Like how I love both my dolls, but in different ways because they're different dolls. Something like that, Ellie agreed, touched by the child's attempt to understand. Liam and Jacob exchanged looks, then Liam spoke for both of them. Does this mean Mother can't take us away? We hope it will help convince the judge that you belong here, Mason said honestly. But we can't promise. We'll do everything we can to keep our family together. All eyes turned to Thomas, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. His face was unreadable, his posture rigid. Thomas, Mason prompted. You've been quiet. Does she know? Thomas asked, his voice carefully controlled. Does she know you're replacing her? I'm not replacing anyone, Thomas, Ellie said gently. And yes, your mother knows your father and I are together. Thomas's jaw worked as he processed this. She left, he said finally, the words seeming to burst from him. She left us. She doesn't get to come back now and act like she cares, like she has some right to us. The raw pain in his voice struck Ellie like a physical blow. She resisted the urge to go to him, knowing he would reject comfort in his current state. You're right that she left, Mason said, his voice steady but gentle. And that was wrong. But she is still your mother, and she does care for you in her way. If she cared, she wouldn't have stayed away for 2 years, Thomas argued, his voice cracking. She wouldn't have missed birthdays and Christmases and everything. People can make terrible mistakes and still love their children. Thomas, Ellie said softly, your mother was very ill when she left. Not physically, but in her mind and heart. That doesn't excuse her actions, but it helps explain them. Thomas shook his head, unconvinced. So you're getting married to stop her from taking us? No, Mason said firmly. We're getting married because we care for each other and want to build a life together. The timing is influenced by your mother's actions, but the decision is based on what we feel. Thomas studied them both, his young face too perceptive, too wounded for his years. And if she wins anyway, if she takes them to Denver, then we'll visit often, Ellie promised. When we'll write letters. We'll never stop being a family, Thomas, no matter what happens. Something in her words seemed to reach him. His shoulders relaxed fractionally, and he gave a short, sharp nod. When's the wedding? Tomorrow, Mason said. Simple ceremony with Judge Parker in Riverford, before the custody hearing next week. I'll be there. Thomas said the words, both a statement and a promise. We all will. As the children dispersed to their chores, buzzing with the news, Mason moved to stand beside Ellie. That went better than expected, he murmured. Thomas is still hurting, Ellie observed. He feels betrayed by Abigail and confused about his own feelings. Been carrying too much, Mason agreed. Took on the role of protector when she left. Hard burden for a boy. He'll need time, Ellie said, and patience from both of us. Mason nodded his hand, finding the small of her back in a brief supportive touch that sent warmth spreading through her. Good thing we have plenty of both. The next day dawned clear and surprisingly cool, as if the weather itself had decided to offer a reprieve for their important occasion. Ellie wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Hannah had helped her adorn with a collar of delicate lace found in the attic. Her hair was neatly pinned, with a few small wildflowers tucked into the arrangement at Hannah's insistence. The ceremony itself was brief and without frills. Judge Parker, a kindly older man, with spectacles and a fondness for the Reed children, performed the service in his office above the Riverford General Store. Mason wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. The children stood in a semicircle, Samuel holding a small bouquet of prairie flowers he had insisted on gathering for Ellie. Do you, Mason James Reed, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Judge Parker asked, peering over his spectacles. I do. Mason said, his voice low but steady, his eyes never leaving Ellie's face. And do you, Eleanor Margaret Hayes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Ellie replied, surprised by the emotional thickness in her throat. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife. Judge Parker smiled benevolently. You may kiss your bride, Mason. For a moment, Mason looked almost uncertain, this most private of men faced with a public display of affection. Then, with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to Ellie's in a kiss that was brief but unmistakably tender. Samuel cheered, Hannah clapped her hands, and even Thomas's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Judge Parker beamed as he signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, officially transforming Eleanor Hayes into Eleanor Reed. As they emerged from the judge's office into the bright midday sun, Ellie felt a curious mixture of emotions, joy certainly, but also a sense of rightness, as if pieces long scattered had finally found their proper arrangement. Their small celebration at Ferguson's store, where the kindly shopkeeper had insisted on providing cake and lemonade, was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Wade Calloway. The ranch hand dismounted hastily, his expression grave as he approached Mason. Reed, he said, nodding a greeting. Mrs. Reed, sorry to intrude on your special day. What's happened? Mason asked, immediately alert to the tension in Wade's manner. It's Abigail, Wade said, glancing at the children who had gathered close at the mention of their mother's name. She's left town, packed up and took the morning stage to Denver. Left, Mason repeated, frowning, without seeing the children again. Wade hesitated, then handed Mason a sealed envelope. She left this for you, said it explains everything. As Mason took the envelope, Ellie noticed Thomas watching intently, his expression, a complex mixture of emotions, anger, hurt, and perhaps a flicker of vindication. I told you, he said quietly, she always leaves. Mason pocketed the letter without opening it. We'll read it at home, he said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed for now. The journey back to the ranch was subdued, the children unusually quiet as they processed this latest development. Ellie's heart ached for them, especially for Hannah, who had begun to warm to the idea of knowing her mother again, and for Liam, who had spent so long keeping her memory alive. That evening, after the children were asleep, Mason and Ellie sat at the kitchen table, the unopened letter between them like a living thing. Should we read it together? Ellie asked softly. Mason nodded, his face grave. You're their mother now in all the ways that matter. You should know what she has to say. With careful fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was elegant and flowing, much like Abigail herself. Mason, he read aloud, his voice low to avoid waking the children. By the time you read this, I will be on my way back to Denver. I came to Riverford with the intention of reclaiming my children, of giving them the advantages that my sister's position and wealth can provide. I convinced myself it was for their benefit that they would flourish in Denver's society in ways impossible on a struggling ranch. But watching them with you, seeing how they have grown and thrived despite my absence, I realized that my motives were selfish. I wanted them because they are mine, not because they need me. The truth is, they don't. They have found stability and love with you and Eleanor. I saw the way Samuel calls her Mama without hesitation, the way Hannah looks to her for guidance, the way Liam and Jacob have flourished under her care. Even Thomas, though he keeps his distance, shows a respect for her that he never afforded me. I won't contest your marriage or seek custody. The children belong where they are loved and known, not uprooted to satisfy my belated maternal instincts. Tell them I love them in my way and that I'm sorry for the pain I caused. Take care of them, Mason. You and Eleanor both. Abigail. Silence fell as Mason finished reading. Ellie sat very still, absorbing the unexpected surrender, the acknowledgement of her place in the children's lives. She's really gone, she said finally. Just like that. Mason folded the letter carefully, his expression unreadable. She never wanted the hard parts of motherhood. The illnesses, the tantrums, the daily sacrifices. Even before she left, she was always elsewhere in her mind, if not her body. The children will be devastated, Ellie said, thinking especially of Hannah and Liam, to have her appear and disappear again so quickly. Better a clean break than false hope, Mason said, though his tone held regret rather than bitterness. They have you now. Us, stability. Yes, Ellie agreed, reaching across the table to take his hand. They have us, and we have each other. And in that moment on her wedding night in a simple farmhouse kitchen, with her husband's calloused hand warm in hers, and 5 sleeping children under their care, Eleanor Reed felt a contentment deeper than any she had known. The road ahead would not be easy. Drought still threatened, finances remained precarious, and the children would need time to heal from this latest abandonment. But they would face it together, this family forged not from blood, but from choice, from daily acts of care, from the deliberate decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. And that, Ellie thought, was a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. The September sun hung like a molten coin in the cloudless sky, baking the earth to a hard crust that cracked beneath feet and hooves alike. 2 months had passed since Ellie and Mason's wedding, since Abigail's brief appearance and final departure. The rhythms of ranch life had reasserted themselves, but beneath the surface of daily routines, tensions simmered, like the heat rising from the parched ground. The drought, which had briefly relented in July, had returned with a vengeance. The creek behind the barn had dried completely, forcing Mason to dig deeper into their precious well for water. The cattle grew gaunt ribs visible beneath dull hides as they searched fruitlessly for grazing. Even Ellie's garden, tended with all the wisdom her grandmother had imparted, struggled to produce more than the most meager yield. And hanging over it all was the bank payment due at the end of the month, a sum that seemed more impossible with each passing day. Ellie stood at the edge of her garden in the punishing midday heat, a bucket of precious well water in her hands. She dispensed it with meticulous care, giving each plant just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Conservation had become their watchword, their religion, their only hope of endurance. "Mama, look," Samuel called, running toward her with something clutched in his small hands. At 6 years old, he remained irrepressibly optimistic despite the hardships around him. "Found a horny toad. Can I keep him?" Ellie smiled, setting down her bucket to examine the small reptile cupped in the boy's palms. "He's wonderful, Samuel, but I think he'd be happier staying in his home in the rocks. We can visit him there instead." Samuel considered this, his face serious. But what if he's thirsty? Everything's thirsty now. The simple observation, delivered with a child's directness, struck Ellie with unexpected force. Yes, everything was thirsty, the land, the animals, the people. Even the air itself seemed to crave moisture, sucking it from skin and lungs with greedy insistence. "We'll make him a little water dish near his home," she promised. "Show me where you found him, and we'll take a little water from my bucket." As they walked, Samuel's hand trustingly in hers, Ellie scanned the horizon. No clouds, no hint of relief. Just the relentless blue that had become their enemy rather than their shelter. Mason appeared from the direction of the north pasture, his shirt dark with sweat, his face set in lines of exhaustion. Even from a distance, Ellie could read the defeat in the slope of his shoulders. "Samuel, why don't you return Mr. Toad to his home, and I'll bring the water in a moment," she suggested, giving the boy's hand a gentle squeeze. As Samuel scampered off, Lizard carefully cradled in his palms, Ellie moved to meet her husband. Up close, the toll of the past weeks was even more evident, new creases around his eyes, a gauntness to his cheeks that spoke of missed meals and sleepless nights. "How bad?" she asked simply. Mason ran a hand over his face, wiping away sweat and dust. "Lost 3 more head. Water holes completely dry. Rest won't last the week without rain." The news settled like a stone in Ellie's stomach. 3 more cattle meant 3 fewer to sell, 3 fewer to provide the income they desperately needed. "Could we drive them south to the Pecos River?" she suggested. "Just until the rains come?" Mason shook his head. Everyone's had the same idea. Rivers crowded, grazing stripped bare for miles. Besides, they're too weak for the journey, wouldn't make it half the distance. Ellie nodded, accepting the assessment. Mason knew cattle knew the land. If he said it wasn't possible, then it wasn't. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about my brooch, the silver one with the pearl. Ferguson would give us a fair price for it." "No," Mason said firmly, the same answer he'd given each time she'd suggested it. "Won't take your inheritance." "It's not taking if I'm offering," Ellie countered gently. "We're partners now, Mason. What's mine is yours." He looked at her, then his green eyes softening despite his exhaustion. "Appreciate the thought, but it's your connection to your grandmother, your heritage. Won't let you sacrifice that." The tenderness of his refusal touched her deeply. Here was a man who had nothing, who faced losing what little he'd built, yet he would not take what he saw as her birthright. It made her love him all the more fiercely. "Then what will we do?" she asked, pragmatic as always. Mason glanced toward the main house where Liam and Hannah were visible through the window heads bent over their lessons. "Been thinking on that. Might be time to talk to Peterson." Ellie knew James Peterson only by reputation, a wealthy rancher whose property bordered theirs to the north, a man who had weathered previous droughts through careful management and adequate capital. It was said he had long coveted the Reed property for its valuable water rights to Stone Creek, which in normal years flowed year-round. "You're thinking of selling land to him?" she asked, careful to keep judgment from her voice. "The north section only," Mason clarified. 40 acres, enough to make the bank payment and buy feed to get the cattle through till winter. It was a sensible solution, yet Ellie sensed Mason's reluctance. This land was more than property to him. It was legacy identity, the physical manifestation of his commitment to his children's future. "If that's what needs to be done, then we'll do it," she said, reaching for his hand. His palm was rough against hers, calloused from work, warm despite the coolness of his skin beneath. "The land doesn't make the home, Mason. We do." He squeezed her hand, a wordless acknowledgement of her support. "I'll ride to Peterson's tomorrow. See what he's willing to offer." As they walked back toward the house together, Ellie noticed Thomas watching from the barn doorway, his young face grave beyond his years. At 15, he understood the implications of their situation all too well. "I'll talk to him," Mason said, following her gaze. "Explain why it's necessary." "We should tell all the children," Ellie suggested. "Together. They deserve to know what's happening." Mason nodded, accepting her wisdom in this as in so many things. After supper. That evening, over a simple meal of beans and cornbread, they explained the situation in terms appropriate to each child's understanding. Thomas listened in stoic silence. Jacob asked practical questions about which acres would be sold. Liam wanted to know if they would still be able to reach his favorite reading spot by the old cottonwood. Hannah worried about the garden, and Samuel, grasping only that something important was changing, asked if they would have to move. "No, Samuel," Mason assured him. "This is still our home. We're just letting Mr. Peterson use a piece of our land that we don't need right now." "But it's still ours," the boy persisted, his blue eyes serious. Mason and Ellie exchanged a glance. "No, sweetheart," Ellie explained gently. "When we sell it, it will belong to Mr. Peterson. But we'll still have our house and the garden and the barn." "And each other," Hannah added with unexpected wisdom. "That's the most important part, isn't it, Mama?" "Yes," Ellie agreed, reaching out to smooth the girl's copper hair. "That's exactly right. Later, as they prepared for bed, Ellie noticed Mason standing at their bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit landscape, the silver-washed pastures, the shadow of the barn, the distant line of trees marking where Stone Creek ran during wetter years. "It's the right decision," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. "Know that," he replied, "still hard." She slipped her arm around his waist and he drew her close, his solidity a comfort in the quiet darkness. These small touches, once so foreign, had become natural in the months since their wedding. A hand at the small of her back, fingers brushing as they passed, tools, shoulders, touching as they sat side by side on the porch steps. The physical vocabulary of their marriage had developed slowly, respectfully building toward an intimacy that honored both their pasts. "My father always said land was the only thing worth having," Mason said, suddenly, his voice low in the stillness. "Said a man without land was no man at all." "Your father was wrong," Ellie replied simply. "A man is measured by his character, his care for others, his willingness to sacrifice for those he loves. By that measure, you are the richest man I know." Mason turned to her, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the pale moonlight. The look in his eyes, tender, grateful, fierce with feeling, made her breath catch. "Don't deserve you," he murmured, touching her cheek with work-roughened fingers. "Yes, you do," she countered softly. "We deserve each other." When he kissed her, it was with a gentle passion that spoke of all the words he found difficult to say: his gratitude for her presence, his admiration for her strength, his commitment to the life they were building together despite the harsh realities arrayed against them. They slept that night as they had every night since their wedding, side by side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Two people who had found in each other not just survival, but possibility. Morning brought no relief from the heat, no miraculous clouds on the horizon. Mason prepared for his ride to the Peterson Ranch with the grim determination of a man facing an unavoidable duty. "Take Thomas with you," Ellie suggested as she packed a small meal for their journey. "He should be part of this." Mason considered this, then nodded. "Good thought. Boy needs to learn these things. Part of becoming a man." As they rode out, Mason tall and straight in the saddle, Thomas beside him trying to match his father's posture, Ellie felt a curious mixture of pride and apprehension. They were doing what had to be done, making the hard choice that would ensure their survival. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely the first of many sacrifices the drought would demand. The day stretched endlessly, the sun climbing to its zenith, and then beginning its slow descent without any sign of the rider's return. Ellie kept the younger children busy with lessons and chores, trying to maintain normalcy despite her growing concern. It was late afternoon when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the lowering sun, and saw Mason and Thomas returning, accompanied by a third rider. James Peterson was not what Ellie had expected. Rather than the imposing figure of local legend, she saw a man of average height, perhaps 50 years old, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He dismounted with the ease of a lifelong horseman and approached the porch, hat in hand. "Mrs. Reed," he greeted her, his voice carrying the slight drawl of Texas origins. "James Peterson, a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard good things from Wade Calloway." "Mr. Peterson," Ellie acknowledged, offering her hand. "Welcome to our home. Please come inside out of the heat." As they settled at the kitchen table with glasses of precious well water, Peterson looked around the modest cabin with appreciative eyes. "You've made this place a real home, Mrs. Reed. It's been a long time since these walls saw a woman's touch." Ellie murmured her thanks, but her attention was on Mason's face, trying to read the outcome of their negotiations. "Mr. Peterson has made an offer," Mason said, his expression carefully neutral. "For the north section." "A fair one, I hope," Ellie remarked, looking to their visitor. Peterson nodded. $40 an acre for the 40 acres, plus first right to buy back the land should I ever decide to sell. $200, enough to make the bank payment and see them through the worst of the drought if they were careful. And the option to reclaim the land someday was more than they could have hoped for. "That's very generous," Ellie said, genuinely surprised by the terms. Peterson waved a hand dismissively. "It's good business. The land adjoins mine has water rights I need. And..." He hesitated, glancing at Mason as if seeking permission to continue. "Mr. Peterson has another proposition." Mason said, an unfamiliar note in his voice that Ellie couldn't quite identify. "Not a proposition so much as an opportunity," Peterson clarified. I've been looking for a foreman for my South Range, someone who knows cattle, knows the land, someone honest and hardworking. He turned to Mason. I'd like to offer you the position, Reed. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and momentous. Ellie looked at Mason, whose face remained impassive but whose eyes held a storm of conflicting emotions. The pay is $30 a month, Peterson continued, plus housing for your family on the property. A proper house, not a line shack. Your children could attend the school in Riverford. I'd provide transportation. It was an extraordinary offer: security, stability, education for the children. Everything they had been struggling to provide through their own efforts now being offered freely. And my land? Mason asked, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. What happens to what's left? Peterson spread his hands. Keep it, lease it, sell it outright. That would be your decision. I'm offering you a job, Reed, not a takeover. Ellie watched Thomas, who stood by the window, his expression a mirror of his father's, carefully controlled, revealing nothing of the thoughts behind it. But she knew both of them well enough now to sense the turmoil beneath their composed exteriors. It's a generous offer, Mason acknowledged. Need time to consider. Discuss with my family. Of course, Peterson agreed, rising. Take a week. The offer stands. He turned to Ellie. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Reed. You've created something special here, drought or no drought. As Peterson rode away, the family gathered on the porch, watching until he disappeared over the horizon. The younger children, who had been playing nearby, sensed the significance of the moment and clustered close, unusually quiet. What did Mr. Peterson want, Papa? Hannah asked, slipping her small hand into Mason's. Mason looked down at his daughter, then at each of his children in turn, his gaze finally settling on Ellie. He offered me a job, he said simply, as his foreman. We would live on his ranch, and you children could go to school in town. Leave here, Jacob asked, dismay evident in his voice. Leave our home. It would still be our land, Mason explained. But yes, we would live elsewhere. I don't want to go, Samuel declared, wrapping his arms around Ellie's legs. I want to stay with our garden and my horny toad and my swing. We could come back and visit, Liam suggested, always the practical one. And a real school would have more books than we have here. Thomas, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. It's because of the drought, isn't it? Because we're going to lose everything if we stay. The blunt assessment, delivered in Thomas's straightforward manner, silenced everyone. Even Samuel seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Not decided yet, Mason said firmly. Won't be rushed into this. We'll talk it through as a family. But what do you want to do, Papa? Hannah persisted, her green eyes so like her father's, searching his face. Mason sighed, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of uncertainty. Don't know yet, Hannah girl. Need to think on it. As the children dispersed, Ellie and Mason remained on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of red and gold that promised another day of relentless heat. It's a good offer, Ellie said, eventually breaking the thoughtful silence. It is, Mason agreed. Practical, sensible. But he turned to her, his expression troubled. This land, it's more than property. It's where I brought Abigail as a bride, where all 5 children were born, where I've poured every drop of sweat for 15 years. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the familiar landscape. Even when Abigail left, the land remained. Constant, faithful. Ellie understood then this wasn't just about pride or independence. The land was Mason's anchor, his one enduring relationship in a life marked by loss and abandonment. We wouldn't be selling all of it, she reminded him gently. Just working elsewhere for a while until things improve. And if they don't, Mason countered. If the drought continues for years, as some are saying it might, Peterson's a good man, but he's also shrewd. He knows this land will be worth twice what he's paying once the rains return. Then we'll have a decision to make when that time comes, Ellie said pragmatically. But right now we need to consider what's best for the children, for all of us. Mason nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. Need time, he said again. To think, to pray, maybe. We have a week, Ellie agreed. Let's use it well. The days that followed were filled with hushed conversations, thoughtful silences, and careful consideration of what Peterson's offer would mean for each member of the family. The children sensed the importance of the decision and expressed their views with surprising maturity. Thomas, protective of the land that represented his heritage, initially resisted the idea of moving to Peterson's ranch. It feels like giving up, he confided to Ellie one evening as they sat on the porch steps watching the stars emerge. Like admitting we can't make it on our own. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is accept help, Ellie replied. It doesn't mean forever. It means for now until circumstances change. Liam was torn between excitement about the school in Riverford and concern for his familiar routines. Would I still have time to read, he worried. Would there be quiet places like my thinking spot by the creek? Jacob, practical and adaptable, saw the advantages of the arrangement. Mr. Peterson has horses, he pointed out, and a real barn, and enough water that things actually grow. Hannah worried about the social aspects of the change. Will the other children like us? She asked anxiously. Will they make fun of my clothes? Only Samuel remained steadfastly opposed, unable to comprehend why they would leave the only home he had ever known, the place where his memories of his mother were rooted. Through it all, Mason remained thoughtful, listening more than speaking, weighing each consideration with the careful deliberation that characterized his approach to life. On the fifth night, as Ellie and Mason lay in bed discussing the various factors in hushed voices, a sound they had almost forgotten interrupted their conversation, the soft patter of raindrops on the roof. They both fell silent, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing. Then as the gentle patter increased to a steady drumming, Mason threw back the covers and moved to the window. Rain, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Real rain, not just a sprinkle. Ellie joined him, standing close as they watched the silver sheets transform their parched land. The rain fell steadily, soaking into the thirsting earth, running in rivulets down the gentle slopes, filling the dry creek bed with a whisper that would soon become a song. Is it enough? Ellie asked softly, knowing that one rainstorm, however welcome, couldn't undo months of drought. No, Mason admitted, but it's hope. A sign, maybe. They stood together, watching the miracle unfold, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, united in their gratitude for this unexpected blessing. By morning, the rain had passed, but its effects were immediately visible. The land seemed to have exhaled, releasing the tension of months of deprivation. The air smelled of wet earth and renewal. The dust had settled, and already the smallest plants were straightening, reaching toward the moistened sky. Stone Creek, which had been reduced to a series of stagnant pools, now flowed again, not with its usual vigor, but with enough force to suggest that the worst of the drought might be breaking. The children raced outside at first light, marveling at the transformation, splashing in puddles with abandoned joy. Even Thomas smiled, tilting his face to the freshly washed sky, as if seeking confirmation of some private hope. Mason walked the property, methodically assessing the impact of the rain on their prospects. When he returned to the house, his expression was cautiously optimistic. Creek's flowing again, he reported to Ellie as she prepared breakfast. Not strong, but steady. South pasture's already greening up a bit. Cattle are drinking their fill for the first time in months. Does this change things? Ellie asked, understanding the unspoken question behind his assessment. With Peterson's offer? Mason leaned against the doorframe, his face thoughtful. Maybe. Need to see if the rain continues. If it's the start of a pattern or just a temporary relief. 3 days later, they had their answer. The rain returned heavier, this time lasting through the night and into the following day. Reports from Riverford indicated it was a widespread system, not merely a localized shower. The drought was breaking at last. On the morning of the 7th day, the day Peterson expected their answer, Mason gathered the family in the main room after breakfast. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, each person aware that the decision would shape their collective future. Been thinking hard on Mr. Peterson's offer. Mason began, his voice steady but gentle. Considering what's best for all of us, for our family. The children watched him intently, even Samuel silent for once, sensing the gravity of the moment. The rain changes things, Mason continued. With water, the land can recover. The cattle can survive. We can meet our obligations to the bank, especially with the payment from selling the north section. He paused, looking at each face in turn, his gaze lingering on Ellie's. But the rain doesn't change everything. School for you children, security for our future, the chance to build something more stable than what we have now. Ellie felt her heart beating faster, uncertain where Mason was leading them. So here's what I propose, he said finally. We sell the 40 acres to Peterson as agreed. I accept the foreman position, but with a modification. Instead of moving to his ranch, we stay here, and I ride to his south range daily. It's only an hour's journey each way. But what about school? Liam asked, his brow furrowed. You said we could go to school in Riverford. You will, Mason assured him. 3 days a week, I'll take you into town myself, and you'll stay with the Calloway family who've agreed to board you. The other days you'll learn here with Ellie. It was an elegant compromise, maintaining their independence while securing their future, preserving their connection to the land while expanding their horizons. And we get to stay in our house, Samuel asked hopefully. Yes, son, Mason confirmed with a small smile. We stay in our home. The relief in the room was palpable, a collective exhale as the tension of the past week dissolved. What did Mr. Peterson say? Thomas asked, ever practical. Will he agree to these terms? Already has, Mason replied. Rode to see him at first light. He's a fair man, understands the importance of roots. Ellie met Mason's eyes across the room, her heart full of pride and love for this man who had found a way to honor both progress and tradition, who had refused to be forced into an either-or choice when a both-and solution was possible. Later, as they stood together at the edge of Stone Creek, watching the newly revived water flow over stones that had been dry for months, Ellie slipped her hand into Mason's. You found a third way, she said softly, when it seemed there were only two choices. Mason nodded, his gaze on the creek but his attention on her words. Learn that from you, he said. Way you see possibilities others miss, like a garden growing in dust. The simple acknowledgement of her influence touched Ellie deeply. This man, who had once seemed so self-contained, so complete in his isolation, had allowed her to shape his thinking, to expand his vision of what might be. I'm proud of you, she told him, squeezing his hand, and grateful to be your partner in this life. Mason turned to her, his green eyes reflecting the newly washed sky. Not just grateful, he said, his voice low and certain. Love you, Eleanor. Should have said it before now. The words, simple and profound, washed over her like the rain had washed over the parched earth, bringing life renewal possibility. In all their months together, through crises and celebrations, quiet evenings and challenging days, he had shown his love in countless ways. But to hear the words spoken in his deep, steady voice was a gift she had not realized she was waiting for. I love you too, she replied, her voice catching slightly on the emotion that swelled in her chest. With all that I am. When he kissed her, it was with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the best things in life, love, growth, and healing, required time and patience. Just as the land needed more than one rainstorm to recover from the drought, their love would continue to deepen through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, nourished by daily acts of care and commitment. Above them, clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising more rain to come. The worst of the drought was passing. They would survive, not just as individuals, but as a family rooted in land that had tested them severely, but had not broken them. As they walked hand in hand back toward the house where the children waited, Ellie thought of how far they had come since that day at the Ash Ridge auction block. From a woman deemed worthless because she could not bear children, she had become the heart of a thriving family. From a man shattered by abandonment, Mason had become a husband and father capable of profound love and trust. Together, they had transformed a house into a home, a collection of wounded individuals into a family, and barren ground into fertile soil where new life could flourish. It was enough. It was everything. October brought golden light and cooler temperatures, the land responding to the renewed rainfall with a final burst of growth before winter's approach. Stone Creek flowed steadily. Now the cattle had regained some of their lost condition, and Ellie's garden produced a modest fall harvest that they preserved with careful attention. The new arrangement with the Peterson Ranch had settled into a workable routine. Mason rode out early 3 days a week, returning by supper time with news of the wider world and occasionally small treats for the children from Riverford. On school days, he took Liam, Jacob, and Hannah into town before dawn, leaving them in the care of the Calloway family until he collected them after his work was done. Thomas had chosen to remain at the ranch, helping Ellie with chores and continuing his education through independent study. At 15, he was nearly a man, and his preference for practical learning over formal schooling suited his nature. His relationship with Ellie had evolved into one of mutual respect and quiet affection, the last barriers of his initial resistance long since dissolved. Samuel, still too young for formal schooling, thrived under Ellie's patient guidance, learning his letters and numbers alongside basic ranch skills. His natural exuberance and curiosity made each day an adventure, his questions an endless source of both challenge and delight. On a particularly fine autumn afternoon, as Ellie hung laundry on the line while Samuel helped by handing her clothespins, she heard an unfamiliar sound wagon wheels approaching from the direction of Riverford. "Someone's coming, Mama!" Samuel exclaimed, always excited by visitors to their isolated home. Ellie shaded her eyes watching as a light buggy came into view, driven by a woman whose silhouette seemed vaguely familiar. As the vehicle drew closer, recognition dawned, bringing with it a surge of complex emotions. "Mrs. Hayes," the visitor called as she reined in her horse. Or should I say Mrs. "Read now, Mother," Ellie replied, stunned by the unexpected appearance of the woman who had stood silent at her auction 8 months earlier. Virginia Hayes looked much as Ellie remembered, tall and thin, with graying blonde hair, neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet, her posture rigidly correct even after the long journey from Ash Ridge. Her face, once beautiful, had been worn into harsh lines by years of deference to Augustus Hayes and his rigid standards. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Virginia asked, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty beneath its practiced, social tone. "It's been a long drive." Ellie hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, Samuel, please help your grandmother down from the buggy." The boy looked confused. He had never heard of this grandmother before, but moved forward with his customary friendliness. "I'm Samuel Reed," he announced, offering his small hand with formal gravity. "I'm 6 years old, and I can write my whole name now." Virginia seemed startled by the child's forthright manner, but took his hand with a small smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Samuel. I'm Mrs. Hayes." As they walked toward the house, Ellie's mind raced with questions. Why had her mother come after all this time? How had she found them? What did she want? Inside, Ellie busied herself making tea, grateful for the simple task that allowed her to gather her thoughts. Samuel, sensing the tension between the adults, volunteered to fetch fresh eggs from the hen house, leaving the women alone. "You have a beautiful home," Virginia observed, glancing around the modest cabin with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Simple, but welcoming." "Thank you," Ellie replied, setting cups on the table. "It suits us." She paused, then asked directly, "Why are you here, Mother?" Virginia's hands twisted in her lap, a nervous gesture Ellie remembered from childhood. "Your father died," she said without preamble. 3 weeks ago, his heart. The news struck Ellie with less force than she might have expected. Augustus Hayes had been a distant figure, even when she lived under his roof, a man who valued propriety and position above affection. His decision to sell her had severed what tenuous connection remained between them. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, the formal words coming automatically. Virginia shook her head slightly. "Don't be. Our marriage was difficult, as you well know." She drew a deep breath. "I've come because there are things you should know, things I should have told you long ago." Ellie waited, watching her mother's face for clues to what might follow. "Your father was not a good man," Virginia continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "He was harsh, controlling, unforgiving of what he saw as weakness. When your husband returned you to us after your child died, Augustus saw it as a reflection on our family's standing. When no other suitable match could be arranged quickly, well, you know what he did?" "You stood by and watched," Ellie said, the old pain briefly resurfacing. "You didn't try to stop him." "No," Virginia acknowledged, meeting her daughter's gaze directly for perhaps the first time in their lives. "I didn't. I was weak and afraid. But I did this." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather pouch, placing it on the table between them. At Ellie's questioning look, she continued, "The morning of the auction, I emptied my savings account at the bank, money I'd been secretly setting aside for years from household funds. I gave it to Josiah at the general store with instructions to find someone, anyone who would bid on you and take you away from Ash Ridge, away from your father's influence." Ellie stared at her mother, trying to absorb this revelation. "You arranged for someone to buy me?" "Not exactly," Virginia clarified. "I provided the funds and asked Josiah to find a decent person who might be persuaded to help. He approached several men, but most refused. Then he mentioned a rancher who was in town that day, a widower with children in need of care, a man known for his fairness and hard work." "Mason." Ellie breathed, pieces falling into place. "You arranged for Mason to buy me?" "No," Virginia shook her head. "Josiah approached him, explained the situation, offered the money, but your Mason refused to take it. Said if he was going to do this, he'd do it with his own funds. Said it was a matter of honor. The knowledge that Mason had chosen to help her, had refused the easier path of using someone else's money, filled Ellie with a fresh wave of love and gratitude for the man she had married. "Why tell me this now?" she asked, returning her attention to her mother. Virginia sighed suddenly, looking her age and more. "Because with Augustus gone, I'm finally free to make amends if you'll allow it. To be the mother I should have been all along." She hesitated, then added, "And because I wanted to see for myself that you're truly happy here, that I did at least one thing right in helping you escape." Ellie considered her mother's words, weighing the years of silent complicity against this one act of belated courage. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but perhaps it was enough to begin building something new. "I am happy," she said finally, "happier than I ever imagined possible through everything that happened. Mason is a good man, and the children," she smiled, thinking of each one, "they've become mine in all the ways that matter." Virginia nodded, relief evident in her features. "I can see it. This place suits you in a way Ash Ridge never did. You've found your purpose here." "Yes," Ellie agreed simply. "I have." A comfortable silence fell between them, the first in their long and complicated relationship. As they sipped their tea, Samuel returned with the eggs, followed by Thomas, who had spotted the unfamiliar buggy and come to investigate. "Thomas, this is my mother, Mrs. Hayes," Ellie introduced them. "Mother, this is Thomas, our eldest." Thomas approached with the natural dignity that characterized him, offering his hand. "Ma'am," he greeted her respectfully. "Welcome to our home." Virginia seemed momentarily taken aback by his poise. "Thank you, Thomas. It's a pleasure to meet you. Eleanor speaks highly of you." "Ellie's been teaching me bookkeeping," Thomas informed her with a hint of pride. "Says I have a head for figures." "He does," Ellie confirmed. "Better than mine, certainly." As the afternoon progressed, the other children returned from school, each reacting to the unexpected visitor with varying degrees of curiosity and politeness. Virginia, who had never had much opportunity to interact with children in Augustus's formal household, gradually relaxed in their presence, even laughing at Samuel's earnest descriptions of his horned toad collection. When Mason arrived home at sunset, Ellie met him outside to explain the situation before he encountered Virginia. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "Didn't know about the money," he said when she had finished. "Old Josiah never mentioned it again after I refused." "Would it have changed your decision if you'd known it came from my mother?" Ellie asked. Mason considered this. "No," he said finally. "Saw what I needed to see that day. Rest was just details." Together they entered the house, where Virginia stood nervously, clearly uncertain of her reception by the man who had purchased her daughter. "Mr. Reed," she began formally, "I want to thank you for Mason," he corrected gently, "and no thanks needed. Got the better end of that bargain, as anyone can see." His simple words, devoid of pretense or judgment, seemed to ease Virginia's anxiety. She smiled tentatively. "Yes, I believe you did." Supper that evening was a lively affair, the children eager to share their school experiences with this new grandmother figure. Virginia, for her part, seemed to blossom under their attention, revealing a warmth and humor that Ellie had rarely glimpsed during her childhood. As the evening drew to a close, Virginia announced her intention to return to Riverford for the night. "I've taken a room at the hotel," she explained, "but I'd like to visit again before I return to Ash Ridge, if that would be acceptable." "You're welcome any time," Ellie assured her, surprising herself with the sincerity of the invitation. "Perhaps you could stay with us next time rather than in town." Virginia's eyes brightened with unexpected tears. "I would like that very much." After she had departed with promises to return in a few days, the family gathered on the porch to enjoy the cool evening air. Samuel climbed into Ellie's lap, Jacob and Liam sprawled on the steps, Hannah leaned against Mason's knee, and Thomas stood nearby, whittling a piece of cedar wood with practiced strokes. "So that's your ma," Mason observed, his tone neutral, but his eyes watchful on Ellie's face. "Seems different than I expected." "She is different," Ellie agreed. "Without my father's influence, she's becoming someone new, or perhaps returning to who she was before him." "Like the land after the drought," Thomas remarked unexpectedly, "recovering its true nature once the harshness passes." The insight, so perfectly expressed, made Ellie look at the boy with fresh appreciation. At 15, he was developing not just physically but intellectually and emotionally, growing into a young man of unusual perception. "Exactly like that," she agreed. People can be like land, seemingly barren, but holding the potential for growth all along, just waiting for the right conditions. Is that what happened to you, Mama? Hannah asked, her green eyes serious in the fading light. Were you like the land during the drought? Ellie considered the question, aware of Mason's attentive gaze. I suppose I was, she said thoughtfully. For a long time I believed what others told me, that I was lacking incomplete barren in the ways that mattered. But I just needed the right place to put down roots, the right people to nurture me as I nurtured them. Like our garden, Samuel piped up. You take care of the plants, and they take care of us by giving food. That's right. Ellie smiled, touched by the child's simple wisdom. Everything and everyone needs both giving and receiving to truly thrive. Mason's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, his touch a wordless affirmation of her statement. They had found in each other the perfect balance of giving and receiving, of strength and vulnerability, of independence and interdependence. As night fell, fully stars emerging in the vast New Mexico sky, Ellie looked at the faces of her family, not of her blood, but of her heart, not of her body, but of her soul, and felt a sense of completion that transcended her earlier pain. What had once been taken from her, the chance to bear children, had been restored tenfold in the opportunity to mother these 5 remarkable young people, to partner with this steadfast man to create a home where healing and growth were everyday miracles. The land around them had survived the drought, emerging scarred but resilient, already showing signs of renewal as autumn rains continued to bless the parched earth. Their family, too, had weathered its own form of drought loss, abandonment, displacement, and had emerged stronger for the experience. In the distance, Stone Creek murmured its constant song, water flowing over ancient stones, carving its path with patient persistence. Like the creek, their lives would continue to flow forward, meeting obstacles, finding new channels, occasionally flooding or running low, but always, always moving towards some greater wholeness, some deeper belonging. Time for bed, Mason announced, as Samuel's head drooped against Ellie's shoulder. Big day tomorrow, finishing the new chicken coop. The children rose without protest, each pausing to bid Ellie and Mason goodnight in their own way, Hannah with a kiss, Liam with a careful hug, Jacob with a cheerful wave, Samuel with sleepy arms wound tightly around Ellie's neck. Even Thomas offered a small nod of acknowledgement before following his siblings inside. Left alone on the porch, Ellie and Mason sat in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen around them. The air held the first hint of winter's approach, a crispness that spoke of changing seasons and new beginnings. Happy? Mason asked, simply, his shoulder warm against hers. Ellie considered the question not with doubt but with the full weight of its meaning. Happiness, she had learned, was not the absence of hardship or the fulfillment of every desire. It was the presence of purpose, the knowledge of being needed, the daily choice to love and be loved in return. Yes, she answered, her voice carrying the certainty of deep truth. Completely. Mason nodded, satisfied with her response. Above them, a shooting star traced a brief, brilliant arc across the sky, a moment of pure light in the vast darkness, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but leaving behind the memory of its passage and the promise that such wonders would come again. Like the star, like the rain after drought, like love after loneliness, some gifts were all the more precious for their unexpected arrival. Eleanor Reed, once deemed barren and worthless, had found fertile ground at last, not just in the soil she tended with such care, but in the hearts of those who had become her family, and in her own heart, which had never been barren at all, merely waiting for the right season to bloom in.